It sounds like an old gospel song, but it's really a civil rights song from the 60s. Oh, healing river, you know this is the wrong key to sing this song in. All right, what is that key? Oh, healing river, send down your water, send down your water upon this land. Oh, healing river, send down your water and wash the blood from off the sand. This land is thirsting, this land is parching, no seed is growing in this barren ground. River, send down your water, send down your water upon this land. Oh, healing river, send down your water and wash the blood from off the sand. Oh, healing river, send down your water, send down your water upon this land. Oh, healing river, send down your water and wash the blood from off the sand. Let those seeds of freedom awake and flourish. Let the deep roots nourish. Let the tall stalks rise. Let the seeds of freedom awake and flourish. Proud leaves unfurling across the sky. Oh, healing river, send down your water, send down your water upon this land. Oh, healing river, send down your water. Thank you. I figured any song with deep roots and tall stalks should be sung at Prairie Festival. Let's see. Well, it's been a wild year since last year. Hold on. But sometimes some of those old songs, they keep being appropriate. So let's see. Right. And this, unfortunately, is one of those. This is a song I wrote in response to an act of Congress. If your life is falling apart, kids don't have enough to eat, lost your job, lost your wallet, and the roof's begun to leak, here's the message you've been needing, the final answer from on high. Oh, it's your fault, it's your problem, go away and die. Your man walked out without warning, left the light bill still unpaid. Baby won't sleep through the night to hear him fuss, has you dismayed. You'd like to take him to the doctor, but you've heard the latest cry, saying it's your fault, it's your problem, go away and die. Go away and die, my friend, go away and die. It's your fault, it's your problem, words wisdom of the wealthy from their thrones. Poor, the sick, the very slow should get by on their own. If you were a millionaire, you could buy the latest tax break, save $1 billion here or there. You could look upon the lowly, frown, and give these words a try. Take personal responsibility. Go away and die. Go away and die, my friend. Go away and die. It's your fault. It's your problem. Go away and die. One more time. Go away and die, my friend. Go away and die. It's your fault. It's your problem. Go away and die. Thank you so much. Well, I actually wrote a new little piece of a verse for that, because truly after that, that was the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunities Act of 1997, I believe, which of course 20 years ago. But after that bill was passed, they also passed the Children's Health Insurance Program, which has been a huge success. And so I wrote a new verse that had not the kids needing to go to the doctor, but the parent needing to go to the doctor. And because the kid probably could go to the doctor now, but anyway, that's more than you care to know. But I've got the old version with the kid needing to go to the doctor so deeply ingrained in my body memory that my mouth will not go to that new version. Well, I've been here at Prairie Festival to the last two. First the wagon pulling out, there's pape and the corn. But this isn't the place where they were born. There's high prayers for steady rain this year. Houses in the fields, there's houses in the fields, and the last few farms are growing out of here. At first he wouldn't sell, and then he would. Now there'll be children playing where the silos stood. The word came from the marrow of his bones. It was the last sure way to pay off all the loans. The open range, and it's a side I'm getting on in years, that nothing new is welcome to these eyes and ears. There's houses in the fields, no prayers for steady rain this year. Houses in the fields, there's houses in the fields, and the last few farms are growing out of here. They're growing houses in the fields between the downs, and the Starlight Drive-In movies all closed down. The road is gone to the way it was before, and the spaces won't be space. If you hear a one verse or one line, really should go there, but all right, either way. One day down from the sky, the final he spoke we can't deny. Whether man or bird or elephant, we shall all become trace elements, and we'll all turn to compost by and by. By and by, by and by, by and by, by and by. Yes, we'll all turn to compost by and by, by and by. When they lay you 6 feet down, you'll enrich this hallowed ground, and we'll all turn to compost by and by. I really sing this in honor of Sarah Cruz, who started Green Cemetery just north of Salina. I met a New Age undertaker from L.A. Said he'd showed me all his caskets on display. His intentions weren't debatable, they were all biodegradable, and we'll all turn to compost by and by. By an apology, you're still good for the ecology, 'cause we're all turned to compost by and by. By and be down, you'll enrich this hallowed ground, and we'll all turn to compost by and by. In that sweet recycling composting. It was in somewhere like Lindsborg or something. It was all the state of Kansas. And at that point, all I knew was the composting song. So I really went for it. So they shortened it up. So now it's just called, with our current governor. So I had to make up a new song. Back then, it happened, and I had just learned Ring On, which you may not know. If you're not, is where you go. You hit the string, and then you hit it with your left hand. You hit it with your pick, and then you hit it with your left finger, and it changes the note. And you can bend it. So I just learned how to do that. So here came this song. It always has a percussion section with it here, like this. That's the hi-hat. What's that in the corner? I can't believe my eyes. Spilling out into the kitchen. I gotta get organized. It's my recycling taking over my place, yeah. I gotta get down to that recycle center and take back my space. Got the plastic number 1, plastic number 2, aluminum cans, and the glass and the bottles too. It's my recycling taking over my place, yeah. I gotta get down to that recycle center. Yeah, he lost it. It's my recycling. It's at a very fast pace. I gotta get down, get down, get down, get down. Save myself from disgrace. I'm praying for curbside pickup. All right. Thank you. Well, it's really kind of calm today. It wasn't calm yesterday. So I wanted to sing this song. The song that I wrote when I was an agricultural intern at the Land Institute, which was really one of the best years of my life. You would not know it from this song. But even at the best jobs, there are days you'd really rather be just about anywhere else. And it was a morning when I was in charge of a particular chore that had to be done. I was pollinating the eastern gamagrass mutants. I don't believe they're working with eastern gamagrass anymore. So my work was for naught. Well, maybe not. But I was also commuting to work on my bicycle in those days, and I lived about 6 miles away in town, and it's about 5 miles straight south. If you're familiar with the prevailing wind of Kansas, the whole morning off working, They said we could stay home and catch up some things. But then they say, you come an hour early. That's the reason I'm left here to sing. Join me now, here we go. My attitude's bad, 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 bad. I'm tired of this wind blowing in my face. I ain't got the blues, I got the uglies, and I can't stand to be around this place. Then they sent me out to pull some weeds. I've been out here pulling these weeds up all morning. I'll be out here pulling these weeds up all day. It seems I've been pulling these weeds for the last 10 years, and these damn weeds just won't go away. Here we go. My attitude's bad, 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 bad. I'm tired of this wind blowing in my face. I ain't got the blues, I got the uglies, and I can't stand to be around this place. Oh, then I went to law school. I sit in this classroom and I hear this guy spouting. The wind that I feel now's a lot of hot air. I got an ache in my head, I ain't catching nothing he said. Well, I had to write a capping off verse. The song wouldn't just keep going on forever. But don't get me wrong, now sometimes I feel better. Of this old bad attitude, you won't find a trace. And next time I see you again, I hope that's the way that I am. But for now, just get out of my face. 'Cause my attitude's bad, 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 bad. I'm tired of this wind blowing in my face. I ain't got the blues, I got the uglies, and I can't stand to be around this. No, 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 I can't stand to be around this place. Yeah. Thank you. All right, what am I doing wasting my good prayer festival time on the bad attitude blues? All right. I think I have to. All right. There's one song I was going to sing that I'm not, but oops. What happened there? The idea started when I was here and we took our first prairie walk out on the 160, we used to call it. I don't know what they call it now. Across the road, to learn the names of the plants. And our guide, Dr. Wes Jackson, was wandering around showing us. And it was in February, and at that time of the year, it's a really good time to learn the grasses because they're all hanging up there in the sky with their seed heads on. And so it's not like in the summer when they all just look green and with green and blades. And so we were seeing the switchgrass and the Indian grass and the eastern gamma grass and the big blue stem and the little blue stem, and they all looked different. And then we came upon this little bunch of black sticks. Had some little black seed pods on it. And some tidy little black leaves, dried up leaves. And we said, "What is that?" And he said, "Oh, that is blue wild indigo," which has got to be the coolest name of a prairie plant. Seems like it couldn't be really from Kansas, but there it is. It's a native. Years later, I ended up writing a song. It took me a long time to see the blossoms, and then longer than that to write the song. Come, my love, and walk with me. Blue, wild indigo. Sunflowers may be brighter still, and daisies cover all the hill. But as strong and fragile go, choose the blue wild indigo. Well, this is my last song, and it's a brand new song. You know, in an uncomfortable year, it'd be probably best to end with some comfort food songs. But I decided, I heard this song last summer at the Kerrville Folk Festival, where I get much of my musical inspiration down in Texas, and I was in a small group, and this guy sang this song, and I said, that guy wrote that song so I could sing it at Prairie Festival this year. And so I went up to him afterwards. I said, I need that song. And so now here it is. I've been really practicing it, and I really hope I don't forget it. So thank you so much. Let me say that my CDs, a whole bunch of them are in the bookstore. I also have these little download cards. If you don't have a CD player, you can get the download card for a little less money. You don't get all the lyrics with it, but you can download directly to your device. Just a minute. I have a website, ianzimmerman.com, Facebook, and Z Music. I'd like to play in your town. This guitar came from a timber, from the body of a tree, through the workshop of a luthier. Now it's on loan to me, and it's good company after dinner, and it fits my hands just fine. But someday another, with a pair of hands like mine, will coax out songs much prettier, hiding in the strings, sing stronger, braver words than I could ever sing. And the folks are gonna love it, that I'm almost sure. So I take good care of it, 'cause I'm borrowing it from her. Pass it along, pass it along. May it land in careful hands when we're gone. You carry it for a moment, time won't loan it to you for long. You don't own it, pass it along. And I still love my country. Sometimes it's hard to recognize, but I count myself lucky to have been born inside it. And I'm grateful for the rights others struggled hard to win. You can bet I'm gonna fight if they try to take them back again. And everywhere are teachers, though some fell along the way, and the words they said still reach us, just like you're teaching me here today. You made it along. Seems these days we're in a hurry to grab up all there is to use, putting patents on discoveries, making seeds that don't reproduce. If our vision is so narrow, seeing only bought and sold, we will end up like the pharaohs, buried with their gold. We've all pushed this thing along, we've all been guided by our fears, but the river sings a song we've got to be quieter to hear. It's in every child's face, new and hopeful as a stem. We best be gentle with this place, 'cause we're borrowing it from them. Pass it along, pass it along. May it land in careful hands when we're gone. You carry it for a moment, time won't loan it to you for long. You don't own it, pass it along, pass it along. Thank you so much. All right. All right, thank you so much. Here's some comfort food music. Oh, give me a home where the buffalo roam, where the deer and the antelope play. Sing it out. Where seldom is heard a discouraging word, and the skies are not cloudy all day. Home, home on the range. Here we go. Home, home on the range, where the deer and the antelope play. Where seldom is heard a discouraging word, and the skies are not cloudy all day. I'm going to sing the third verse, but a lot of you are from out of state, and you may not know that this is our on the range, where the deer and the antelope play, where seldom is heard a discouraging word, and the skies are not cloudy all day. Have a great day. Thank you so much.
Check, test, check, test, do, test. Mic check, test. Are we back to just the mids again? Or we have the whole thing? Test, check, test. Check, test, 2, please. Check, 2, test, mic check, test. Get the... All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're just trying to get this microphone successfully equalized so we won't have to deal with any of this annoying feedback when Rachel approaches the microphone. So if you can just bear with us for a quick second, we are almost there. Low mid, high mid. Check, test 2, mic check, test 2. Are we good to go? Are we close? Okay. Rachel.
All right, are we ready? How do I sound? It's a beautiful morning on the prairie. Welcome to day 2. I would invite everyone to join us here in the barn so that we can make up some time so that you can go to the bathroom later. Thank you and welcome. I'm not going to say much other than to welcome our longtime friend and colleague and current board member, Brian Donahue, to the stage to kick us off for today. Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to introduce myself a little bit. I'm going to tell you 2 things that you need to know about me, if you don't already. And one is that I've been farming for a while. I dropped out of Brandeis University when I was a junior in 1975 and started farming in a suburb there where we still have a community farm. So I have that background of growing vegetables, and I co-own a farm with friends out in the western part of the state of Massachusetts where we raise beef cattle and heritage pigs and cut timber and that. So I'm telling you that so you know that I have a long history and dedication to the kind of work we do at the Land Institute and the sustainable agricultural movement. I believe in this stuff heart and soul. But the second part of my character is that I'm an academic. I'm an environmental historian. I study the history of farming and forests in New England, and I am by nature and by profession intensely skeptical, which is what you have to be a good scholar, and you have to be particularly skeptical of your own fondest beliefs, which we, I think, heard a little bit about yesterday. So you need to know those 2 things about me. I have a modest title for my remarks here. Yeah, and I added a subtitle, Making Links with Urban Farmers, Consumers, and Cities. I do this by giving you a bit of an update on stuff out here at the Prairie Festival before about the visioning process. Visioning we've been going through in New England to the rest of the country, particularly as a springboard for the big topic that's on my mind, and maybe yours, and it came up a little bit yesterday, which is how we resettle the countryside. What kind of investment that takes, how we get people to do that, which is what we've been talking about for a long time. So in New England, we've been going through on several different ways a sort of visioning process, a conservation visioning process about the future of the region. And the people who are involved in the forest part of this started in 2010 with a publication called Wildlands and Woodlands. That was out of Harvard Forest. And then a bunch of other scholars that I was also part of on the agricultural side in 2014 published the New England Food Vision, which looks at how much food we could grow there and what good that would do us. And then Tuesday, we released a combined one, Wildlands and Woodlands, Farmlands and Communities, envisioning the future of New England. So I'm going to just tell you a little about these things as kind of a regional look at what could be done. The Wildlands and Woodlands, the forest vision sets the natural framework. New England is 80% forested today. We called for over the next 50 years that 70% of that be permanently protected, 10% of the protected land in wild reserves, but the rest in sustainably managed forests to produce timber and all the rest of that, the woodland side. And the forest delivers a wide range of a spectrum from the city out to the countryside of great social and environmental benefits that include water quality, carbon sequestration, habitat for biodiversity, recreational, spiritual connection, and renewable wood products. And in particular, this is a great way to sequester carbon. When you compare building with wood to building with concrete and steel, it's an amazing difference in terms of the energy and carbon that's required to produce the stuff. And you can now build some really big buildings out of wood. There's a new classroom building at the University of Massachusetts that's 4 stories high. You can go much beyond that with cross-laminated timbers. This is a really coming kind of thing. And it builds jobs in rural areas, and rural New England and Maine has just lost its pulp industry. It needs a new sustainable kind of rural industry on the forest side. Then given that natural framework, the food people asked, okay, how much food could we grow in this region? And what benefits would that deliver? Because everyone talks about local food, and that's what I mean about being skeptical of your own beliefs. But gee whiz, I mean, New England, to give you an idea, the 6 states of New England, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts in the south, and Maine, Vermont, and New Hampshire in the north, that's about the same area, a little less actually than the state of Kansas. But there's 15 million people there, which is 5 times the state of Kansas. The amount of farm, because that's important, because food is not just food, it's different kinds of stuff. Vegetables do not take a lot of acreage. We could grow all of our vegetables in New England. There's some seasonality issues, but basically the acreage is there to do that, and there's enormous social and environmental benefits and health benefits from growing vegetables locally. As Catherine Sneed was talking about yesterday, it's a way to empower people, connect them with what they eat, do it on a small scale. Urban and suburban areas can do a lot of this. So that's a great thing to grow locally. Fruits. We could grow more of our fruit in New England. We've lost a lot of that in the past century to places like the state of Washington. We currently produce about half of our dairy products, but it's only partly on grass and alfalfa. It's lots on corn silage and in feed that's bought in. If we put it all on grass and did all of it, that would take up the rest of that farmland that I just told you about. It would be a healthier way for the cows, healthier for us, healthier for the environment, sequester carbon, as Tim was talking about yesterday, because it's perennial. The beef, we could do all that if we cut our beef consumption, which we probably should. And that's it. You're out of acres. I mean, you can increase the grain production within that a little bit, and there's almost no grain production in New England, and do some of the nice local malting and artisanal baking and so forth, which is good. We can't come anywhere near growing all of our grain in a place like New England. We don't have the cropland for it. We don't really have the right weather for it. To tell you the truth, there's no value in it. If you have limited cropland, you're not going to waste it on wheat. Honestly, I mean, just run the numbers. And the same thing applies to places like the state of New York and the rest of the Northeast. That ratio, there's 8 million acres of farmland in New York, but there's 20 million people. These parts of the country can grow more of their grain locally and do some great things, don't get me wrong, but the feed grain particularly, but also the grain wheat has to come from someplace else here. It has to come from the Midwest. So the bottom line is we can grow half our food in New England, we can't grow the other half. We have to be half local and half global. And actually, Angus gave a great talk about this about 20 years ago. Remember, Angus, about the cosmopolitan side with the, right in this barn around 1996. And that's a good thing to be. We do not want to be all local and parochial. We want to be connected to the rest of the world and ask the same kind of them and surrounding them. So you start with a set of strong values, social values, health and justice, basically. You build the community infrastructure around those, the transportation, the housing, the health, the rest of that stuff, the energy, and then through and around it is the natural infrastructure. That's the way these visions are constructed. And there's places for wildness within that as well. So we've been thinking about how we could do similar kinds of visioning processes for other part of the country in conversation with one another to look at this thing from different angles, because it's radically different out here, the kinds of answers that you would get. So this analysis says the Northeast is still going to need grain and oils and meat from the Midwest. So what would it look like in Kansas? Now, Kansas can produce all its fruits and vegetables, in one county. Basically what Wes was talking about yesterday as he grew up in the Kaw Valley, that would do it. So what about the rest of the state? It's still going to be growing grain and meat for the nation. So the issue then is how you do that. And if that's more a grass-based approach to the meat, and if that's a grain approach that takes the livestock out of the feedlots, puts them back on the farms where they belong, gets those pastures going in rotations with hay that keeps some manure there, and then we start to bring in the perennial polycultures for the grains and oils, you've got a vision for the future of a place like Kansas or Iowa. And because the Northeast has sacrificed a little forest to grow more pasture and grow more food, you have room out here to rebuild that natural infrastructure. More riparian kinds of floodplain forests, have these visions put together, and we're actively thinking about how we'd set up a process to do that. I want to stress again that the idea here is not that every locality or region should become self-sufficient. That's just the wrong premise to start with. If you start with that premise, you end up advocating mass migration and starvation. When we all used to eat locally centuries ago, you had a famine every few years. We do not want that. So the issue is, how do you take a look at the place where you are, become more self-reliant in places where that makes sense, nature and biodiversity and wild places. That's a set of values that these things can all be built around. Now, I want to finish off with just some thoughts about how this might be accomplished. To care for woodlands, farmlands, and fisheries in this way is going to require resettlement of the countryside by farmers and other people who work on the land who hold these kinds of progressive values. And let me stress, that's not a large percentage of the population. You're talking about a back to the land movement, but it's a couple percent of the people. It's just more farmers than we've got out here now who can take that kind of care to survive. We've got to pay them something for that work. But what about all the other stuff they're producing if they do it right? The water quality, the carbon sequestration, the biodiversity habitat, the beauty of the landscape. That's what we ought to be organizing ourselves to reward farmers for producing, and we ought to be enabling to do that. Not saying you just got to make it on the price of asparagus and compete with some that's grown on some, vast industrialized farm. So, we've been promoting this idea, and the philanthropists and foundations and impact investors and all those great people, they always ask you, well, we want metrics, how does it, is this working? So, this experiment has been run, actually, and it's been run in a little place called Vermont. This is the smallest state in the country in population. There's one congressional district. very rural. Burlington, the capital, has 40,000 people. It's smaller than Salina, okay? About the same size. In the 1970s, 35,000 hippies moved to Vermont. And look at it today. It's the most progressive state in the country. Bernie Sanders launched his career as mayor of Burlington. This experiment has been wrong. I mean, I have a farm in western Massachusetts in the Pioneer Valley and up in the Berkshires. That's a more progressive place than Boston. And that's partly, not entirely, I don't want to oversimplify this, because a bunch of people went there and they stayed. They did not all give up and go. They might have gone to Burlington, and they became social workers and local businessmen, and some of them are still farmers, and they're all on town boards and state commissions, and they're running the place. And they're putting a certain kind of people in the Senate of the United States of America, which is the important point of all this, is that it has a political as well as economic dimension. So what if 35,000 people went to a rural, beautiful congressional district in, let's say, Pennsylvania, or Michigan, or Wisconsin, right? So do the math here. There are rural districts out there that have been neatly gerrymandered for repossession. There's nobody out there, and they're in the most beautiful places you can imagine. They got woodlands, they got farmlands, they got brook trout, they got the whole thing. You put a few farmers out there, support them well, and then you get the farm-to-table restaurants and the little summer theaters and the brew pubs and the hard cider stuff and all the rest of this. And honest to God, you take a while, but in the meanwhile, good things are happening, and you've got a kind of transformation in the countryside. I mean, if we're not talking about that, what are we talking about? Okay? And once you've got the constituency in the countryside, then you've got the political clout, because look, progressive values are not going to succeed in this country with just an urban constituency. The country isn't set up that way, politically. So we need this in the countryside so that you can then reinforce all this with the kind of government policies that it needs to reward this kind of behavior and make other kinds of behavior more difficult. That's what government's about, but you have to win elections. And progressive has written off the countryside for 100 years. So that's not so good. But again, it's not just the farmers, it's the landscape they create, and then it's the connection to the people who've got to support them. The people who are joining CSAs ought to be buying land, not just paying for an annual share, but let's buy 1,000 acres out there, put it in some kind of co-op. So that's what we're thinking about. It's going to require a massive investment of private capital in land, with people who want to work for conservation values, want to work with land trusts to protect it, and want to create that kind of a world. That's kind of what I had to say. Severin, I think, will be addressing some of these ideas later on this morning, so I'm looking forward to that. That's it. You have any questions? Simple. Let's go do it. And I ate up 10 minutes. We're back on time. What is that, my entire assignment? Cool. Any questions? There are some things. Mary. No, hopeful, not optimistic, please. Oh, thanks, Mary. Oh, yeah. Yes.
I just had a thought about the carbon sequestration you were talking about. But what I'm also thinking is that when you're saying the CSA people should buy land, is that called financial sequestration?
There's an idea.
There's public banking and other forms like that.
Financial sequestration. Did everyone hear that? Okay, so we talk a lot about carbon sequestration. So you're putting all this wealth of carbon, taking it away from where it's doing damage in the atmosphere, putting it in the soil where its organic matter does good. And she suggested if people buy land for these kinds of purposes, we could call that financial sequestration. What's that? Yeah, well, so there's a practical, buy land. I mean, that's always Pete.
And we don't have any control over that right
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you know, I'm giving a jaunty little Sunday morning talk. This is lifetime slogging stuff. That there's going to be a lot of losses, a lot of difficulties. There's going to be a lot of tension in the countryside, obviously. If people come in like this is a fraught kind of thing. I don't mean to be like we can just waltz out and do it, but I mean, there it is. Yes, sir.
Have you and your collaborators thought a little bit about how a universal...
At it. But I don't want to be in a place where all these other political things have to happen before this becomes possible. I want to say, okay, there are a lot of liberal, progressive people who've got quite a bit of money, and is there a way that they can utilize that in maybe some very focused ways? And see, exurbanization is going to keep happening anyway. People are going to be moving to the countryside, so the issue is, are they going to chop it up and fragment it into pieces that make it harder to work that landscape, or can it be done in a new kind of way, and where you can start building into that process, okay, that's a gentrification process, so how do we build in affordable housing to that maybe utilizes local wood, and so there on the local level there might be a policy change where, you know, you're going to build elderly housing, but it's going to use local timbers. It's kind of a long-winded answer just to say these things have to work along together. Dick?
I love the fact you mentioned Vermont.
Why not?
Because my oldest son is a young farmer in Vermont growing rice.
Rice.
He hadn't even thought about it, maybe. But there's a crop that could get great expansion in Vermont and could provide local food and would not be a grain crop. It would be growing something on land you would be growing grain. So,
What kind of land is he growing rice on? Because it's a grain in my book.
Well, but it's not wheat land.
Oh, yeah.
When you talk about people
So it's,
grains, I
yeah,
think wheat, oats, whatever.
good cropland.
Yeah, rice is a different
Yeah.
animal. It's land you shouldn't be growing wheat on. And it works.
Right. So there are other wrinkles to this, and I don't mean to completely denigrate growing grain in a place grains. I'm not trying to say that's all crazy. I think it is crazy to think we could feed all of the Northeast on grain that's grown right in that region. Yeah. Sure.
Yeah, you did mention briefly in passing something about winning elections.
Yeah.
And while I think all of us support the hundreds of things individuals, communities, neighborhoods can do, I keep coming back to winning elections, which I should say in November of 2016, I think a lot of us felt, gosh, we didn't win, and I can't believe that the majority of Americans are actually in favor of the direction that Congress and the administration seem to go. And I get a little nuts that some of the most idealistic people in the country, 7 million of them voted for third-party candidates. Would you say a little bit more about your conception of winning elections? I mean, we got to win elections.
Yeah. Well, I don't think it's a slam dunk. I mean, I just think that, and people are going to keep voting for third parties and vote the way they're going to vote. And some of the people who are already living in rural areas, when they see this wave of young farmers coming at them, are going to think that's great, and some are going to feel invaded. And so I guess it's just not simple. But I would just like to shift the balance and take advantage of this kind of opportunity. Some people who are large donors to political parties who want to win elections, and that's what they have on their minds, might compare the efficacy of what I've just suggested to throwing money away, all their money away on TV ads. And in the meantime, might get something done. So I think there are people who are concerned mainly with political consequences, who could look at this kind of broad visioning stuff strategically and say, aha, there's a place where even on a shorter time framework, we might be able to make a large difference, and, there you go. Sure.
Okay, skeptical question.
Great.
Going back to your Vermont example, and tell me if I misheard this, but it sounded like the solution to a lot of the rural problems in Vermont was for urban progressive hippies to come and migrate and colonize the state and muscle aside the rural folks that were in political.
Well, I don't know that in political sense, yes.
So that sounds like a recipe for a lot of
I think so.
And probably the existing residents wouldn't be too happy about that.
Probably not. But
Did I hear this right?
you heard this right. I think, but I'll tell you something else. A lot of the locals in Vermont got along pretty well with these young folks who came in. And once they saw that, even if they didn't know what the hell they were doing, they were willing to work and had some spunk. They're like, well, maybe these kids can learn something. And there's, people doing their dissertations on this and do that, and it's up to them to learn how to and not behave like total idiots. Anyway, we have to keep moving on here. So that was the last question. Thank you all very much, and yeah. And my next duty is to introduce our next speakers, who are Wiley Harris and Özlem Altiak, who are from Texas. Wiley holds a BA from Carbon and the Global and North Divides, among other divides, and they're going to, I think, talk a little bit about one example of what it's like to try to pull this kind of thing off. So here you are, folks.
Good morning. It's humbling to stand up here, not only looking at the program and seeing who else is standing up here this weekend, but also just from having had a chance to visit with people along as we've been here, of telling the folks who had approved this project I proposed. About that, I'm not going to be able to do what I said I was going to do that you said you would pay for. How about this other pretty much totally unrelated project that I've come up with instead? Would you be willing to fund that? And the folks here at the land were very kind and gracious, and they said, that's all right, come on ahead anyway, we'll make it work. So during the course of that fellowship program, I met a young man named, he was young at the time, Fred Utzi, who I guess some of you might have come across. Fast forward a few years, Fred and I have a couple of things in common. One of them is that we both come from this family farm tradition, and we've both grappled over the years with different ways of trying to stay connected with that land and the farming operation while still enjoying some of the other conveniences of modern life. And, Fred's aware of that too. And so he was getting the theme of this year's festival hammered out and called us up and said, Wiley, I know you guys are making a go of living out there on the old family ranch, and we think you might have a thought or two that would be relevant to this year's theme if you didn't mind to come and share it. And I said, well, Fred, we're touched and honored, but about that, at the beginning of this year, we gave all that up and moved to town. And Fred, in that same tradition of kindness and graciousness, said, well, that's all right. Come on ahead anyway, and we'll work it out. So that's why we're here, and I'll hand it over to my wife to continue for a second.
Good morning. I think this is for taller, fairer-skinned men, maybe. No, I did. Thank you. I was just being facetious. If somebody told me 15 years ago that I would be given a talk at an event like this, I would laugh. I would not even know what the event was about. I guess my connection to the land and to the Land Institute requires two stories. One is a story of disconnect, really, of my inability to understand my father's connection to the land. He was born on a harvest day, wheat harvest, in 1945 in this village 2 hours inland from the Mediterranean coast. That would be close to a few hours from the Syrian border today, to give you an idea. It's a very agricultural area, but like other people of his generation, he had to leave it in order to gain more money, prestige. He was one of the 2 of his 13 siblings to be able to go to college and become an engineer. So we grew up in the city without being able to understand what that plot of land that he refused to sell meant to him. And I remember that it was the saddest I have seen him when he had to sell it because he couldn't afford to pay the interest on the debts that he was accumulating to raise his 3 children. So fast forward about 10 years, more than that. No, after he died in 1996, I went on to college, and then I went to Texas to get a master's, where I met this man. And so my other story is a story of connection to the land that began with him and our trip up to his folks' place from College Station, Texas to almost to the Oklahoma border. We were traveling one evening, and at some point I realized this guy that I thought was so nice might be kidnapping me because there was nothing. And I told him, this is what? I said, what is this? He said, what do you mean? I said, this miles and miles of nothing. And that must be offensive, Wes. But to me, there was just grass. There was nothing else, some trees I couldn't see in that moonlight, just the headlights, and we turned on gravel roads, and I started getting scared. And I said, no, he can't. He's not going to kill me. He's just like, this is going to work out. And so it was a really lovely house, and his folks were great. They had just moved from town into the house, and the story after that is just a story of joy, really, the best part of my life. We grew lots of things together, and now we're growing 2 kids together. So just the ability to grow your own vegetables. Never tried grains. Well, he did. I don't think we succeeded very well. But and to be able to eat our own beef from our own cattle, that's amazing. That's amazing. But it is also hard work. And in one of these, I'll just give you an example of the kind of work that it requires. We have 2 places. One is his mother's, where her house is, and one is ours, where we have our house. We call it the hay house because it's built out of hay bales. And we shepherd our cattle between the 2 places. And there is a blacktop, an asphalt road between the 2 places, inconveniently located. And so we do this 21st century mechanical shepherding thing with him leading them and me kind of standing where they might go into the neighbor's gate. It's really not glamorous work. And so one of these days we were engaged in the same adventure, which is regular now. I went up to the top of the road to slow potential traffic down. Now, we don't have much traffic, or we didn't used to about 8-10 years ago, but now we do because we have all these wineries popping up, bringing Dallas folks to enjoy the scenic view and the wine and all that. And so it's a little more tricky now. I have to stand there, and I need to be really seriously watchful. And then on one of these days, I was there, and Wiley was shepherding the cattle across the asphalt. And then this white SUV just slowed down, and there was this wide-eyed lady. Just, really you could tell she was so satisfied. She had wine and the scenic view, and then this was really cool. And so she says, she actually posed a question that we've often grappled with and didn't know how to answer. She said, "Oh, is that the farmer?" Okay, you'll just have to imagine the Texas twang. It doesn't overlay very well with my own accent. But that's how I came to be on the land. And I'll leave with that question of whether that is the farmer and switch to Wiley.
So that's a question that we face a lot of times in a lot of ways. I've lost count already of the conversations I've had with people just this weekend where one or the other of us says, well, a real farmer. And what is a real farmer? And that's a question that we really need to, I think, hone in on and be conscious of the terms we're using and what we mean, especially if we're trying to come up with some way to do these things that we're talking about this weekend and get better connections between the city and the country and the people who grow the food and the people who eat it. And there's a lot of unpacking that you could do with that question. Who's the farmer? Is that the farmer? First of all, and most obviously, here are two women stopped by the side of the road asking each other what's going on. And one of them assumes that the other can't be the farmer. If she's got any connection to this, she must be the farmer's wife, right? Because women are farmers. So there's the first one. But, when you think about the agency in this country that manages agriculture, supposedly, the USDA, their definition of a farmer is pretty broad. I don't know, there's probably several people out here who could throw it out for me. But if you sell in 1 year at least $1,000 of agricultural products, you're considered a farmer by the United States Department of Agriculture. If you narrow that down to the number of people in the country who are breaking even on the agricultural products that they sell, you lose about half of the 2 million farmers, and you're down to around 900,000 or 1 million. And if you tighten it up to only the ones who are netting around the U.S. median income, so a little over $50,000 in a year, then you're down to 320 or so farmers, again, out of a national population of over 300 million. 1,000 farmers. Right. So, as Brian mentioned, there aren't that many, and so when you're starting from that small of a base, you don't have to add that many to make a big percentage increase. But again, this is, another thing we talk about is, agriculture in rural areas, and I think a lot of us, myself included, tend to conflate that a lot of the time, and we tend to think, okay, when we say rural, we're just talking about farmers and farm country. And maybe the farm country part is true, but depending on who's doing the defining of what rural is in this country, you've got a rural population of somewhere between 45 to 60 million people. And again, those 320,000 earning a living farmers are dispersed amongst those other millions. And then you come to this term, agrarian. And I don't even want to attempt to define that. But I think we've heard already plenty just this weekend to justify the claim that you don't have to be rural to be agrarian, nor do you necessarily have to be a farmer, at least by any of the definitions that I've just mentioned. Maybe you grow almost all of your own food and you don't sell a dime of it. Maybe you live an ethic of caring for the soil and the land without growing any food at all. I would argue that all of those people could still be considered agrarian in some meaningful way to the project that we're working on this weekend. We personally, I would say, fall into all three categories and into the first two definitions of farming. We make more than $1,000 a year on our enterprises, and we don't, at least most years, we don't lose money on it, but we're certainly not making a living. So we're part-time farmers. As of January of this year, we're weekend rural dwellers, and we're full-time agrarians. I count as the fifth generation of my family that's been on the land that we work. My ancestors first showed up there in North Texas sometime in the 1850s during Texas's first attempt at statehood. The last time anybody made a living on that land was my grandparents, and they managed to put all four of their kids through college on that living as well. That was the first generation of my family to go to college. And if you follow the trajectories of those kids through their lives, they all reflect, whether by choice or not, kind of the different broad strategies that I think still exist for balancing this desire to remain on the land and remain connected to the land on the one hand, and to have sort of a comfortable modern existence on the other. From the uncle that went into the spectrum, who went away pretty much entirely for the duration of his career, was a high-powered business executive living different places all over the country, and only at his retirement did he come back to the farm and sort of take up the life of a gentleman rancher. You could look at my dad's path. He was a civil engineer with the state highway department. He managed to keep his postings within that system to within an hour or so's one-way drive of the farm, and he used the income from that profession to support the nighttime and weekend farming, or his other brother who worked blue-collar jobs close to home, lived right on the farm the entire time, but didn't have as much disposable income to throw after the farming habit, and didn't have a whole lot of more extra hours to put toward it than my dad did. When I was growing up, my uncles and cousins would all get together for the farm chores, whether it be working cattle or baling hay. And I was the youngest of my whole crop of cousins, so I was just getting underfoot in those days. I wasn't able to pitch in. And by the time I was old enough to pitch in, everybody else had aged out of it or dispersed to some other pursuit. And so nowadays, we buy our hay in, and I still haul it myself. And when it's time to work the cattle, I either haul them to the vet or call the vet out to our place, but I'm not about to try to take that on solo. I didn't really think as I was growing up that, I wasn't conscious anyway of a desire to stay connected with the land and take up farming as a vocation. But it had enough of an impact on me that I knew I wanted to be working outdoors in some capacity with whatever career I pursued. So I chose biology as a major in undergrad. I didn't learn till later that what I saw recently summed up in a BBC interview with a professional ecologist who said, there are only so many formally trained scientists, and many of them have to spend more time in front of the computer than you might expect. So biology as a choice of profession doesn't necessarily achieve that goal of keeping me outdoors for my day-to-day. I was lucky enough to get a chance to travel for several months between college and graduate school, mostly in Mexico and South America. And that, strangely enough, was sort of the wake-up call for me in terms of what a privilege it is to have stable access to land. And as a result of that, I sort of became aware of a sense of obligation that, at least on this particular patch of ground, if I don't take on the task of nurturing that land, there may not be anybody who will. And obligation is a bit too blunt of a term to throw at it. It's that sense that I should be doing it if no one else will, and also a sense that my doing that will be a source of pleasure to people that I care about. And so kind of from that moment of realization forward, I could think of my life as sort of a set of serial compromises between that desire to be a homecomer and a homesteader and a liver on the land, an agrarian, and lots of other desires that we come across in life, such as to have a life partner, to have a family, to have a decent income, to have health care and high-speed internet and good schools for the kids. So starting in graduate school, we were both at Texas A&M. That's about a 5-hour drive one way from my family's farm. And I would do that drive at the start and end of every weekend through 7 years of graduate school. We moved back to the farm when I was finished with my PhD, and we were there for about 9 months. And then Özlem started her PhD at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. So during those 5 years, I was 2 weeks on the farm and 2 weeks in Wisconsin, and that was how we split it up. And when she got close enough to the end that she wasn't needing to teach or take classes, she moved back full time and promptly landed a job where she still is teaching at the University of North Texas in Denton, which is only a 1-hour one-way commute. And she did that 2 days a week for most of those 5 years. And it's only this past January, when our first daughter was old enough to start kindergarten, that we finally broke down and said, I went through the small town schools that our daughter would be going to if we didn't leave the farm at this point. And I feel like I turned out okay, but at the same time, I don't know if I want to roll those dice again with her. And so from that, I think I'll hand the mic back over.
So what I was doing up in Madison, I was pursuing a degree in sociology. So I'm a sociologist, and when I am faced with questions as big as these, the question of change, we see a problem. How do we make change happen? I get excited, but then I get depressed because Sociologists know something about what we call social structure. And that's essentially the idea that we are all born into certain patterns, certain arrangements of practices, ideas, institutions that make it very difficult for any one individual to chart their own course as they wish. And I think somebody said this nicely, men, of course, back then it was normal to just say men make history, but they do not make it under the conditions of their own choosing. And that's essentially what we're talking about here. Many of the cards have been dealt, and we have to play with the cards that we've been dealt. When we say social structure, we're talking about the context of agriculture and farming, like patterns of land ownership. It's really one of the biggest sources of wealth inequality, perhaps in the world, a very deep source of wealth inequality that cuts across other issues such as racial and gender inequalities. We're talking also about patterns of work, who gets to do what kinds of work, and how work is valued. We're also talking about what kinds of jobs are considered respectable and make you stand out as a story of success among your peers, for your parents. All these things that I think people who are trying to affect change, people who are in this barn today, perhaps are grappling with, or at some point did grapple with, or will perhaps grapple with. And I can talk about some examples of how this plays out, some of the exclusions and inclusions that we all experience or observe play out if we have time for it later. But so if we inherit this weight of history, we find the world not as we like it, but as it is, and the landscapes and the culturescapes that we would prefer were changed. How do we make change happen? I would like to propose a concept that I have been developing in another context, in the context of my own research that has nothing to do with farming and agriculture. I would like to propose that we think with this concept of a native outsider. The concept of native and the notion of nativeness is too loaded for my taste, as you can see from my accent, because there is so much bad that happens in its name. But when I say native outsider, I'm trying to catch a dynamic, a tension between these two terms. Native, that is being of a place, being ties to and roots in a place, which can be developed. You don't have to be born in a place to be a native to that place. I'm also talking about how people recognize you as belonging to that place. And I think that is largely a result of your presence and your deeds. A third dimension of being native to a place is feeling like you belong to a place. And that is also, it also has a very social dimension. You can't just feel it because you feel it. People have to recognize that you belong to that place. So what do I mean by a native outsider? A native with deep roots and ties in and to a place would sort of know the landscape, would know its history, would know the culturescapes, would know what ideas prevail, what people mean by certain words, and those little subtle gestures that is mutually understood. Being a native means that you have a really good handle on these things, but, and here is the tricky thing about being a native, is being aware of all of these does not necessarily make you want to go along with them. So you need to be an outsider as a native in order, I think, to make change happen. You need to be an outsider in two senses. One, you need to be able to stand outside the social relations. This is not really possible. This is the sociologist. But you need to be able to observe. You need to be able to observe that what we take for granted is not at all natural. That it was the product of millions of people doing things certain ways, and that it can be changed. And if we don't like it and we want to change it, it is up to us. So being an outsider means recognizing that things have come to be this way because people made certain choices, and that we can undo some of those choices and make new ones. Being an outsider also means questioning this notion of nativeness and not taking it for granted. So I would like to suggest that a lot of the people that people in this room have read and respect, including Wes, including Wendell Berry, Gene Logsdon, all the guys and gals. Sharon Astic, is that somebody who's also gone back to the land? Are native outsiders. They have been somewhere else and have had these ideas about how things should be done. They have come back to their places of origin, which gives them a certain sense of authenticity and authority. The two etymologically share the same root, authority and authenticity. I think of Wiley as a perfect example of a native outsider. Folks around where we are plant Bermuda grass, because that's what you do. As soon as we got on the land, he set about restoring native grasses. So I would like to suggest that we think of ourselves as native outsiders. We think and play with this notion of what it means to be a native outsider, but also recognize that as individuals, whatever we call ourselves, we cannot affect change. We need communities. We need communities of practice. We need communities that will help boost our morale when we are skeptical and when we are down. There is a guy, this wasn't in part of my talk, but hearing Brian talk about his skepticism reminded me of this guy, Antonio Gramsci. And he speaks of this notion of having a pessimism of the will, a pessimism of the intellect, what Brian is talking about, but an optimism of the will. And when we feel like we don't have that optimism, it may be because we're lacking that sense of community, or we're disillusioned with how much we have been able to accomplish. So I remind all of us to build communities, to stay close to those communities, even if it's in our isolation, once-a-year events like these that help build community, and come back to this notion of how we can make change little by little to be ready for when perhaps the conditions are more ripe. So it's not at all a waste of time or effort to talk about these ideas, to talk about basic income, to talk about a living wage, to talk about environmental justice, to talk about racial justice. All of these ideas, we have to keep pounding on them, because the time will come when we'll be ready to roll them out and say, we have a vision, we have a plan, and here are the communities that are already doing it. Thank you.
Speaking of hard acts to follow. There's a reason that she usually gets 100% of the mic time in our family, and I sit in the background. There would have been a time that I would have argued against classifying myself as a native outsider, but I had to give it up. And I didn't have the terminology at that time, but what crystallized it for me was once when I had sat down and tried to explain to one of my uncles what I was researching for my graduate work at Texas A&M, and he was nice enough about it. He didn't roll his eyes or laugh at me as I was making the attempt to explain it. But when I got back the next weekend, my parents were chuckling over what he had told them about that conversation. And they said, "Yeah, I realize while he's not down there studying at A&M, he's down there and they're studying him." So we are hoping that the story that we're attempting to tell doesn't come across as we tried to make a go of farming on our family's land and everything, the deck was stacked against us and we couldn't make it work. The story that we're trying to tell is we tried to make a go of living a version of the agrarian dream with the deck stacked largely in our favor, and due both to the weight of history that Oslo mentioned, circumstances being as they are, we have chosen to modify the implementation of that dream yet again in light of other priorities. But I want to spend the rest of the time that we have, and we're at risk of squandering Brian's carefully sequestered 10 minutes. What time that we do have, I want to try to broaden it out beyond just our experience and to say something that I hope would maybe be relevant or inspiring for others in similar situations or contemplating being in similar situations. We were dealt by the genealogical lottery the get out of jail free card on the single biggest obstacle to entry for new farmers, which is that we have stable long-term access to land. And that enabled us to make the choices that we make. And what we'd like to talk about is things that could be done to enable more people to make that choice, to give them the option to get out on the land and stay on the land if they so choose. And as the theme of this year's festival emphasizes, for all that goat cheese dairies and CSAs and so forth are wonderful and necessary and vital, I want to try to talk about this in a way that will also envision viable ways of creating that choice that encompass growing most of the calories on most of the farmland as we get more people onto that land. And I want to focus on the fact that doing so may entail consequences and require adjustments that we haven't considered and that we're not entirely or maybe even a little bit comfortable with. This project and the people who are drawn to it as new farmers and new agrarians may not be who we think of or who we even want as new farmers. Where I grew up, there were a couple of little German Catholic colonies, basically, that were founded at the end of the 1880s and the beginning of the 1890s. And it's funny how language changed. My aunts didn't talk about the Germans as Germans; they called them Dutch. They were from Germany, but to my Anglo-descended aunts, they were Dutch people. And that's not the only phrase I could call up. My aunts refused to call kids kids; they were children because kids sounded vulgar. Kids were goats' offspring. They would never be caught saying bull; it was always the old gentleman cow. And so the Germans were Dutch, and they lived there for from the last decades of the 1800s up until World War I, speaking German, publishing German language newspapers in these tiny little towns, and sprinkled in amongst all of these Anglo descended folks in the other communities. And my aunt sort of summed it up as saying, those Dutch folks, they were queer folk, but they were good neighbors. and it's the same, I think, kind of acceptance, be it grudging or not, that we all have to sort of try to find within ourselves of whoever shows up to participate in this, regardless of whether they meet our expectations or not. Getting out onto the land and farming, whether for a living or just for the agrarian impulse, growing your own food, etc., may not pay as much as we or the new farmers think that it should. There's this notion of farm parity, and there are probably agricultural historians present in the building who could lay this out in much better detail and with greater accuracy than I can. But as far as what I've read, that idea of farm income parity, which is just simply stated that, you know, a family farming for its living ought to be entitled to the same material standard of living as a family that's getting its income from some other source of employment, seemed to sort of creep in as a plank in farm policy like in the early 19-teens or so. And it seems to have been so thoroughly implemented that now I think most of us, if not all of us, would sort of have that as our default assumption without thinking about it. But on the other hand, most of the new farmers that I know, as much money as they might be doing pursuing other professions or careers, they would have to be, but have accepted it as a condition, one of the priorities that they've set, and they're sacrificing income for it. This new agrarian project may involve patterns of land tenure, organization, and or population distribution that we're also not accustomed to, or at first blush willing to tolerate. I've sat around in workshops and heard Wes speculate that maybe agriculture on the plains would work better if instead of every farmhouse spread out on its own section, you brought all the farmhouses into little village clusters, and everyday people walked out or traveled out by whatever means to the fields and worked them and returned home to a community at the end of each day. Brian bought his farm together with another family that's friends of theirs. There's a intriguing phrase in Severin's title. I haven't even had a chance to meet her, much less quiz her about it, but this issue of customary rights, I think, if I'm interpreting it correctly, may feed into this thought. There's a book for sale in the bookstore, a collection of essays called Rooted in the Land, and one of those essays is a fairly utopian vision of how a Kansas county might go about making local policy to effectively set aside most of its farmland as a farm trust and get new farmers onto the land that way. So there are all of these ideas that are floating around out there. Many maybe haven't even been formed yet, others just haven't been implemented. And again, I think we need to be open to those rather than dismissing them out of hand. I would just throw out this observation that what we think of as cultures of permanence, I think usually get the way that they are out of necessity. Form follows function. It isn't people so much choosing that they want to live in a particular way and farm in a particular way that nurtures and cares for the land, as that they're mostly forced or constrained into those practices by the conditions in which they find themselves. Most of the time, in that land is so scarce that you have to develop those techniques in order not to starve. Something in things like paddy farming and livestock husbandry and farming on alpine terraces, and those are intensely labor-requiring ways of farming. And there's at least some evidence that when people in those cultures and societies do get access by whatever means to a larger land base, they switch to farming that in a way that doesn't require as much hard work and doesn't husband the soil as well as a consequence. I used to read Wendell Berry and think, wouldn't it be nice if we could actually achieve the sort of agrarian vision that he's articulating? And then I would get depressed because I think, well, the machine is just going to keep on devouring people and land until nothing at all is left. Later on, I came to find hope in the realization that the faltering of that machine is not impossible. In fact, it's inevitable due to material and energy constraints that anyone with a basic ecological education should be able to appreciate. Just because those constraints didn't play out in the ways and at the times people thought they were going to in the 1970s doesn't mean they're not going to play out somehow, sometime. So for me, with that thought, the urgency has translated from stopping the machine before it's too late to getting ready for it before the machine stops, to minimizing the wrenchingness of that transition, to preserving and spreading the knowledge and incubating the arrangements that will be necessary until conditions are able to support them rather than suppress them. If what I'm saying in that last little bit makes sense, great. If I've lost you, then I would refer you to a little paper that's being handed out by Stan Cox over at the bookstore, if there are still copies left. It's 100% Wishful Thinking, The Green Energy Cornucopia. It's a quick read. Great writing by Stan, as always. And so I guess to kind of bring it to a close here, I think, again, that as I was trying to articulate, whatever we come up with in the way of a new agrarianism is not going to look familiar to any of us. And that we do need to reach deep inside ourselves for the courage, when confronted with it, to be gracious and kind, and rather than rejecting it, say, that's all right, come on ahead, we'll work it out. Thank you.
Thank you both. We'll take a quick break. If we can get back as close to 5 after as possible, that would be fabulous.
Check test 2, mic check test 2. Are you just wanting to do a line check? Or you need to do any EQ on it? We're good on that one? Okay. Stage left, there we go. Check, man, check. Stage left, table mic. Mic check test. I'm holding it very close to my mouth, but more than likely it's going to be back about here. But Scott's going to try to encourage the speakers to hold the microphones closer to their mouths, and we'll see how that goes. So mic check test under optimal circumstances for the stage left panel mic. Check test 2. Check test 2. High mid. I'm holding it too close now. Shall we split the difference and assume that it's going to be right about here? Man, those drop out fast. Check 2, test 2. Do you think it would be helpful if we told them to take the mic off the stand when they were speaking into it, or just let it go like it is? Don't hold them. Closer. Yeah. All right, you want me to keep going or move on to the other one? Keep going? Panel mic. Stage right panel mic. Check mic check test 2. Stage right panel mic. This is stage right panel mic. Check mic check test 2 test 2. We are going to be sharing this microphone among at least 2 or 3 people, but okay, you good? Okay.
We put this up for, if you're going to sit here, we just try to put that up to catch your eye line so you can share it.
I know.
So know that if you get more than 8 or 10 inches away from this, it really won't pick out if you want it. There should be enough line. Definitely enough line, you just pull it toward you. So you get about 8 or 10 inches away from it, pick you up. So just make sure you go ahead and feel free to pull it toward you to speak and share.
Dangerous after you scoot out. That's it. Dangerous after you scoot back.
Hey Scott, will you put your voice into that mic so people start?
Hey folks, we'd like to get started with the rest of today's talks. So if you could begin to make your way back into your seats, that would be great. Thank you. And what I think I'll do, I'll introduce each of you just briefly so they know what name goes with what human being, and then I'll circle back and sort of a little bit more introduction about each person to invite those initial comments. I'll start with Lee, then go to Jack, then
That's okay, that's fine.
Then change and then return. It'll be about 5 minutes each, and then we'll put it
Forever
Fred's time
in the
down.
Brianna debate. And it's whatever. It's both.
Same thing happened last year. We got so
It's
far
fine.
behind last year. We got so far behind
The
last
debate
year.
part of the name.
Fred started when it was supposed to be over. And
I told him we actually set the end time 15
I saw a lot of Oklahoma plates in the parking lot.
I saw a different down here.
So that's encouraging.
Okay, folks, we're going to get going with the Kernza perennial grain commercialization panel. And perhaps in defiance of the reality of the current consumer food marketplace, the stage is crowded with Kernza participants and collaborators. We are beginning to crowd our way into the marketplace. To echo Aslam only in this one part, I wouldn't dare otherwise, but we may indeed be making history with a perennial grain making its way into market, but we are not doing it entirely on terms of our own choosing. The consumer food marketplace and the production ag marketplace greet perennial grains with a certain amount of baggage and some preconditions, as you can imagine. And we aren't doing it alone. We, the Land Institute, characteristic of the organization throughout its history, we have a lot of collaborations. The Land Institute brings a lot to the table, but we aren't a consumer food processing company. Shocker. So, so we have a number of great partners who have leapt into this really, milestone event of a perennial grain reaching the marketplace, the consumer marketplace. I'm going to introduce the folks on the panel for you. What we've asked them to do is to just provide this sort of overview of what have their experiences and the organizations that they represent. What have their experiences been with Kernza perennial grain as a harbinger of perennial grains? Because it's not all about Kernza. This is a big deal, but it's the tip of an even bigger deal with a lot of other crops in the pipeline from a lot of other places. So they'll talk a little bit about their experiences with Kernza in the marketplace for the organizations that they work for, and then talk a little bit about what they see in the next 5 years, maybe, in the marketplace ahead. It'd be very quick. It's a 45-minute panel. We'll try to save some room for questions at the end. So I'll introduce everyone very quickly and then come back to introduce their comments. First on the end, hopefully staying on the end and not on the ground, we have Dr. Lee DeHaan, as you know, with the Land Institute, and then Rachel Strower, the Chief Operating Officer of the Land Institute, Jack Erisman, a farmer from Pana, Illinois, Bree Feeney from Plow, which is spelled P-L-O-V-G-H, but pronounced P-L-O-W, if you would. Plow is a partner in kind of matchmaking Kernza producers and Kernza growers for the Land Institute, and then James Farag from Patagonia Provisions, which is a division of Patagonia. So after earning his PhD from the University of Minnesota, Lee DeHaan came to the Land Institute initially as a perennial wheat breeder. And then he had a little hobby with intermediate wheatgrass that for the last 15 years has blossomed into the Kernza perennial grain program at the Land Institute. And Lee has been leading the intermediate wheatgrass and Kernza perennial grain program at the Land Institute, and to some degree internationally in terms of the Land Institute's role and his role in that for almost 15 years now. So we got an overview of intermediate wheatgrass and Kernza research yesterday, but we've asked Lee today to talk a little bit about sort of the what does Kernza mean and what is the context of Kernza in the overall mission of the Land Institute.
Thanks, Scott. When I go out and visit with people, I often get the question, so how's the Kernza rollout coming? And I have no clue what to say when they ask me that. And so I do what I've learned to do, which is if you don't like the question, try to figure out what's wrong with it. So I started by looking up that word rollout, and it had a root origin that I wasn't even aware of, which is it was rolling out new airplanes. So they literally rolled out the airplane from the hangar and showed it to the world when they came out with a new airplane. That's where we get the word rollout, and it's now used for everything. It has a rollout. But it occurred to me that with Kernza, we are not rolling out a new product like a new iPhone. We are creating the aviation industry. So this is the very beginning of a totally new thing. It's not a slight tweaking or just a new product hitting the market that we expect it to roll out over the next 18 months. Now we are on a long-term trajectory of creating something totally new. Wes, when I first was here, was talking a lot about the comparison to Kitty Hawk and where the Land Institute was relative to the creation of airplanes. And so that kind of got me thinking about that, and I actually looked up some of the history of aviation, starting with Orville and Wilbur. Great quote, which helps us to think about how much we should consider planning for the future. He said that, Wilbur writes that I confessed in 1901, I said to my brother Orville that man would not fly for 50 years. Ever since, I have distrusted myself and all predictions. So, I think that's kind of what I'm up against when people say, well, what's going to happen in the next 5 years? So 1903 was the first flight. And this is 1901. He said it wouldn't happen for at least 50 years. And I think I've led the charge being similarly pessimistic. So I think I'm in good company there. So how long did it take from 1903 to get to sort of modern aviation? The first commercial flight was in Tampa, across Tampa Bay. That was in 1914, so 11 years after the first flight. That was one guy flying one passenger across Tampa Bay, and it lasted for only 4 years. It wasn't viable. We didn't have commercial flights being really viable until 1925, which was the Ford Trimotor was invented, which was a plane that could carry enough people that it became viable commercial aviation. So here we are 22 years after the first flight. First transcontinental flight was in 1938, 35 years after the first flight. And really, if we want to look at success, which is what sometimes people are asking me, well, how long is it until Kernza becomes just like our annual grain crop? So in 1958, one half of transatlantic passengers were flying by air rather than taking ships. And it's not surprising that at that time, a first-class ticket by boat cost exactly the same amount as an air ticket. So that was basically the break-even point. And ultimately, it was 2010, Charlie Mainlander's farm, 5 miles south of here, Assyria, Kansas. We had about 30 acres planted on his farm, and he harvested it with a normal combine. We got a whole semi-load of grain. We hauled it out to a mill in western Kansas, milled it up, and started putting it into things and trying it. So, that was like the first flight for me. It was a goosebumps moment where we looked, wow, we can actually get something to grow. The yields were low. We see all the problems. It was not much better than the Wright Flyer of 1903, but it showed the promise and where we can go. So the first commercial flight took 11 years for them. It was only 2 years later that Birchwood Cafe started selling products on their menu in Minneapolis, Minnesota, with Kernza in them. Kernza waffles was 2 years later. So now we're way ahead of schedule. It was permanently on their menu in 2013. In 2015, we had sustained sales all the time at Birchwood Cafe. 2016 was Long Root Ale, was the first product that was actually packaged and sold. So we're only 6 years in. Maybe 2018, we'll look at a product coming out maybe from General Mills, more of a national scale product from a very conventional company. Question is, how long till we get to be similar to wheat? And I think that 55-year time frame is really actually pretty reasonable. So in order for the price to be the same as wheat, the yields are going to have to be quite similar to wheat. And I think we're looking at 50 years from now or so to hit that target. So it wouldn't be that much different than the development of aviation. So we're not talking about rolling out just one new product, but creating a whole industry from the beginning. But in terms of making these predictions, I think we've made mistakes on being overly pessimistic, and those are always the quotes that get quoted. But there's plenty of quotes the other way. I like to point this one out. Arthur Summerfield, the U.S. Postmaster General in 1959, said, Before man reaches the moon, your mail will be delivered within hours from New York to Australia by guided missiles. We stand on the threshold of rocket mail. So this is totally believable. And so we see that we can be pessimistic or we can be overly optimistic. Either way, but I think the goal of someday being right up there with other crops is totally believable, but it's gonna take some time.
Thanks, Lee. Next, we're going to hear from Jack Arisman from Goldmine Farms near Pana, Illinois. And Jack, Lee mentioned the Birchwood Cafe in Minnesota, and it was Kernza from Jack's farm that was the first Kernza that made its way to Birchwood to be putting products on their menu. So Jack's going to talk a little bit about that experience and kind of as an early producer in that supply chain, and then also I think has some experience with long-time organic farmer, looking for all the progressive best ideas that are ecologically sound from a production perspective. And so this notion of what do perennial crops mean in a kind of beyond no-till regime for a production grain farmer. Jack?
You just gave my speech.
Yeah. Check's in the mail, right?
Yeah. Let's follow the continuum of the airline. Who was the first person to jump out of a plane and survive? And when? Well, it was an accident of circumstance. I'm sure. I'm always looking for new things. I've always been an experimenter on the farm. And that's the joy of doing it, learning things and finding out. And coming here is one of the real highlights of my life, and being able to be on this podium is rather unusual, but I'm pleased to have been invited by Fred, whom I happen to sit on a board with, so it's who you know, it's not what you know. And they were looking for some sucker to plant this new crop, and they found him. So I planted 9 acres in the fall of 2011, I think. Yeah, Lee sent me 100 pounds of seed. Yeah, that was right. And so we cultivated this little patch of ground that was difficult to till with 36-foot equipment, that kind of thing, and it was oblong, and so, yeah, let's put it into permaculture. And this is great because organic farmers are always getting hammered for tillage. You know, we're breaking down the soil structure. We're not giving the microbes a chance to rebuild. You know, what we need is more grass, and then grass presents its own kind of a problem when you try to go through rotations. You know. So that's a whole different story, and involves all kinds of technique. I'll bring you up to date. We still have that growth. And Lee tells me 2 years ago, well, last year I think it was, he says, well, you're probably not going to get a very good yield. And I said, well, why not? I thought I planted a permaculture. I'm excited about it. I don't have to till it. All I have to do is, well, it's becoming root bound. He was right. It's becoming root bound. That's a problem. So it's almost like, if you want to compare it to something that we work with plants on the farm, it's a little bit like alfalfa and autotoxicity, although it's not the same biologically because it's the root system. And I will tell you, if you try to put a spade in that ground, you damn well better be heavy. Because it's really tight. It's really tight. Some of you may have gone out and done the old biological test. You put a tighty-dighty, you dig a slit in the ground and put this white cloth, cotton, in the ground to see what kind of biological activity you have. And after 6 or 8 weeks, hopefully you've gotten some moisture. And if it comes up and it's just in total tatters, you've got pretty good biological activity. Not too bad. And you're pleased with what you have. I did that this last summer in this, in this 9 acres? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. It was this Hanes briefs, brand new ones. The ground was so tight I couldn't get the slit as deep as I wanted. If you dug the slit deep enough, then you would have exposed so much root mass that you destroyed the opportunity for the microbes to really do what they wanted to do. Response being, or the analysis being, we think, too dry and too tight. There's nothing there. They were a lot deeper. So those are some of the things we've learned. We did a new planting with a later generation between the two 250-pound range yield per acre. I sent you all those figures. I don't have them anymore. But all of that was donated to the University of Minnesota to see how we could hull and use this grain and mill this grain and see where it would fit. So long story short, and to be somewhat brief, I've never received a dime for a pound of Kernza.
Thank you, Jack. Next, we'll hear from Brianna Feeney, who is a market manager for Plow. And Plow is they're based in Wisconsin, and they are a source, a matchmaker, but in a way, but a source for food and feed grade perennial grains, rotationally grown crops, and emerging new varieties. So they sort of are specialized to take on the challenges and to find and to kind of match producers and growers for these crops. Brianna grew up on a farm and has worked other places on the coast, right, West Coast, and is still based in Wisconsin.
Thanks. I've been asked to speak about the supply. Okay, I'm sorry. I have a little bit of a lisp, so bear with me. Supply and demand and market development for Kernza and what that looks like for Plow. On the supply side, we do a lot of organization with farm instead of being upside down in one or the other, because both sides take on risk. And in the last 2 years, I think we've gotten a lot better at understanding those risks and mitigating those risks through creating diversified supply base and a diversified marketplace. I was asked to address what do customers think about Kernza, and this is the most fun part. So I'll start with beer. Patagonia's Long Root Ale, I mean, I would say successful. I've only heard great things. People love it. I'm constantly asked where Amy Halloran yesterday gave our 100% Kernza pancakes her stamp of approval. The good customer feedback I have heard on the malting side, it is a little high in protein, and the hulls are a little to really malt, but on the flip side of that, brewers have had a ton of success with Kernza. So yeah, I mean, I feel incredibly encouraged by that. And while we are not quite there, the challenges that processing has presented. Yeah, so, and in the next couple years, in collaboration with the Land Institute, universities, farmers like Jack, and Plow, you know, keeping close track of data sets and just working as sort of an extension agent, I hope that best growing practices and on-farm agronomics start to become more clear. And on the supply side, or on the demand side, I'm sorry, I'm really hoping to suss out the challenges that we face with processing so that everything is smooth and automatic. So I would say the discouraging side is that there's a lot of hull and a small germ, which processors are not used to seeing, wheat processors. But there are a lot of different avenues that we are taking with this. Recently, teff has come up as something that we could model this processing after, or rice. And being in Wisconsin, there's a lot of wild rice growers in Minnesota. So there are options. It's just shifting these mindsets between this is not a commodity wheat and this will not probably ever be moved along the supply chain like a commodity wheat. the encouraging thing is that what I'm hearing from feedback from processors that we send Kernza to is that they see a real difference in genetics. The C5 genetics, the germ seems to be substantially bigger to the point where it will be much easier to process. And I know that Lee is working hard on this, and Jim Anderson and University of Minnesota and UW and Cornell and just so many great minds are behind this. And so I really think that we're on the cusp of figuring it all out.
Thank you, Bree. Thanks for taking that one on.
Yeah, it's
next, we'll hear from James Farag, who is a senior manager for product at Patagonia Provisions. Patagonia is a division. Patagonia Provisions is a division of Patagonia, correct?
That's correct.
And seeks to source and market foods produced in ways that regenerate and restore. Shared harbinger was long root ale. So we'll hear from James.
Thank you, Scott. So Patagonia, as most of you probably know, is for the last 40 years has primarily been an apparel company with a strong environmental focus. So much so that we like to think of ourselves sometimes as an environmental activist company, masquerading as an apparel company. And food has always been a passion of our founder, Yvonne. And over the last few years, well, for a long time, he wanted to get into the food business because he felt like he could have an even stronger environmental impact. Kernza, and my director, Birgit, tells the story that when she started with Provisions, Yvonne walked up to her desk and dropped a bag of Kernza on her desk and said, "Do something with that." and so Birgit approached the Land Institute and Lee DeHaan about 4 or 5 years ago, and at that time, we were told that it was still in development. It's not ready for commercial use. There's still a lot of work to go. It's kind of that typical, business versus researcher kind of, tug of war. It's like, it's not ready yet. We need to study it more. And business is like, no, let's do it. And so, Birgit said, let's. Another 50 years. Another 50 years. At least said another 50 years. And Birgit said, I think we should get this in the ground and test it. And so, with Lee's help, we identified some growers in northern Minnesota who are grass growers, a lot of experience growing perennial ryegrass, and partnered with them, contracted with them to grow Kernza on our behalf. And it being a new untested crop, we made special arrangements with them that we would basically guarantee, because it was kind of unknown what the yield would be and the growing practices and such, or the results rather. Guarantee them a certain figure per acre in order to grow it, so we could test and actually, ensure that they would, it would be worth their while to take on this journey with us. And so that was 3. So, and they were conventional farmers, and we asked that. We required that they would grow it organically, because that's very important to Patagonia, obviously. And so they planted organically, began farming organically, and so it was a transitional field from conventional. And so this year actually is 3 years. So in order to, as many of you may know, convert from conventional to organic, it's a 3-year process to be certified. So the Kernza that we've harvested over the last 3 years has not been certified organic, though it was grown to organic standards. This year's crop is the first one that is certified organic, so that's very exciting. And so, let's see. So that was kind of the initial supply side of trying to figure out how to make sure we had some Kernza to work with, and then what are we going to do with it? How are we going to tell that story? And so there's a big education piece that kind of goes along with that, as far as letting the customers know, why is this in our product? Why is this important? Why are you using this? And we thought, what better way to tell that story than with a beer? And so, so we came out with Long Root Ale. It uses 15% Kernza as part of the grain bill. And we partnered with a brewery in the Pacific Northwest in Portland, Oregon, to brew. They're an organic brewery, a certified B Corp. So they've been an excellent partner. And So we began, so we made this is a little bit challenging. You have to work within. So although we would love to have it available, we're working within the distribution channel with the partner brewery. So right now, only on the West Coast. And we feel like one possible path forward that we're looking at is partnering with other regional breweries around the country to kind of, take that model and replicate it and use, regional ingredients, regional, resources. So maybe one on the East Coast, maybe one, in the Midwest here, in hopes that we can get Kernza beer to everyone who would like it. The response so far has been wonderful. People are really happy with the beer. The main complaint is, where can I get it? Why can't I get it yet? Let's see.
Several of us on staff have become experts at smuggling long root ale.
Yeah, I've had multiple requests to ship it.
I'm not going to say any names, Tim Cruz, but we've gotten specific instructions on how to get it through baggage claim. From no names, Tim Cruz. I have in this kind of flight metaphor, just a quick question, either with regard to Kernza, but more really perennial grains as a whole, and Patagonia's vision for its engagement with the food marketplace, which is big and diverse and challenging, I'm sure. What is the Kitty Hawk? Yeah. With regard to, from your perspective, for perennial grains to find products and find a market in the food marketplace?
Well, I mean, so like I said, the beer is kind of our first, foray out, just because it's a good conversation starter, right? People can talk about it. But we have plans, and we're currently working on incorporating Kernza into other food products. I can't tell you exactly which ones, but we have a number in the works right now. So hopefully within the next year or two, you'll see Kernza in other products. But to that point, we're also looking at other perennial projects. So like the silphium oil is one that's really interesting. That's kind of next, at least from talks I've had with folks at the Land Institute, that's kind of like next on deck as being ready for commercialization. And so for us, it's really important to kind of come at our product development through that lens of coming from an ingredient centric standpoint first. So like what is the impact that this ingredient's having on the soil, on the land, and how can we incorporate that into a product and then take that to market and share it and share that story. And part of Patagonia's mission is to use business to inspire solutions to the global environmental crisis. So even though we're a small company, I'm sorry. I actually specifically earlier said, make sure you turn your ringer off. And when I did that, I must have flipped it the other way. So I apologize.
Oil's ready.
Right? That's the call. But to use business to inspire solutions to the global environmental crisis. And so we see this as an opportunity to have an impact on folks like General Mills, who, have a much larger footprint, much larger impact in the food supply chain than Patagonia Provisions does at this point. So we find that very encouraging that someone like us can come to market and start that conversation and kind of help it along and hopefully help shine a light and pave a pathway for other folks who are interested in following that path as well.
Thank you, James. Thanks very much. You may remember that yesterday, I think Tim mentioned the biculture that's being developed in partnership with Patagonia. So it'll be the first commercially produced Kernza grown out of a biculture. So there'll be a legume, I think alfalfa, that will be grown in a biculture with Kernza to sort of begin analyzing the fertility data and then the fertility narrative when fertility is built into the system. And you will want to know that I don't know where all those plots are, but one of them is at the Perennial Agriculture Project outside of Lawrence, and it's been affectionately named already Little Patagonia.
Oh.
That little plot. So next we have Rachel Stroher, who is as you know, is the Chief Operations Officer for the Land Institute and plays a role in a number of, in fact, most of the things that are happening at the Land Institute. And we asked Rachel to be a part of this discussion, specifically to talk about these partnerships are emerging and they're diverse. You can see there are differences. It's international to some degree, certainly national in many respects. And so the question that we're throwing out for Rachel to help us with is, what do these partnerships mean in the coming years for the Land Institute? Again, our clear transparency, we're not a food processing company. But we are working on food products that will become food. So, Rachel, we'll hear from you.
Great, thank you. Well, I think it's appropriate that this Kernza commercialization started as a farm-to-table thing. Jack providing the Birchwood Cafe with a small supply for them to mix in a little percentage into their pancakes and waffles. And then Patagonia as sort of the next level is great because it's this sort of maverick hyper-environmentalist corporation, and so that's perfect and appropriate. But as you know, our vision for Kernza and all of our grains is even bigger than that. And so I think it's great that there's a sort of market signal from General Mills that there's more beyond that. I want to talk about how these things, this activity, reflects back to the Land Institute itself. On one hand, this provides a public face to the reality that this idea of perennial polycultures is no longer a pipe dream, it's a reality. The scientists have proven that, and they've published on that, but most people can't read and understand what they've said in those publications. And so this is sort of a market way of saying this is happening, and it's biologically possible and a real thing. The second way that it comes back to the Land Institute is that it brings awareness to this organization. We are a nonprofit organization, research organization that still raises almost over 90% of our annual operating budget every year. So all of these beer drinkers now know about us, and hopefully they know that we need their money too. So those are the two main benefits, and then I'm going to keep it short because we're almost out of time. But the last thing that I want to point out is that I think the way that we spend resources as an organization is a good symbol of where our focus is. And we have a limited pie. And so there's this effort to sort of pre-commercialize, as we sometimes like to say, Kernza. And we do spend some of our resources on that. But I think to the extent that that pie remains limited, this organization will continue to steward that effort, but like I said before, our vision is much bigger, and so we will continue to focus our dollars at the research that will create a grain and grains and a polyculture with enough yield to cover millions of acres rather than, 250 maybe? 300 today of Kernza. So that is really our focus as an organization, while stewarding and making sure that these first few airplanes don't crash, thus leaving the public totally unwilling to get on.
Thank you. So I think in order, so that we, out of respect for the schedule of the day and for other guests, I think we're gonna move on. But I'll remind you, James, Brianna, Jack, Rachel, and Lee. If you can find them, I mean, you know how this works. Most of you have probably been here before, but we'll all be here. We'll all be hanging around. So don't hesitate to come up and ask questions if you'd like. And you can always send questions into the info@landinstitute.org, and we can pass those on and answer them. But I have to move on so that we... Oh, I'm sorry. My name is Scott. Thank you. That's what I'm going by today, so we'll go with that. If not, Tim Cruz is my name. So let's have one more round of applause for our partners and guests. It wasn't much time, so I just sort of stayed out of your own way. So.
Hello. Oh, there we go. Are we good? Fabulous. Well, I would just like to say you're welcome for getting you all back on schedule by keeping my remarks very short. And we'll move on. Fred is going to come up to introduce our last speaker.
So before I introduce our speaker, we're going to say a word here about a Prairie Festival institution that continues this year, and that is to have a Strawn Donnelly lecture on conservation and restoration. I never had the fortune to meet Strawn Donnelly. I know from a rich oral history here of the pivotal role that he played in the intellectual life of the Land Institute, including on the board of directors here until his untimely death in 2008. He also leaves a written history. One of his signature concepts that has been meaningful to me is the concept of orchestral causation, the idea that the symphony can start over a viola, puff of air into that. Each has its own sound. The surges is a bigger and richer thing than any of the individual things that caused it. That's the way that I know Strawn Donnelly is through his writing. I'm going to turn to Bill Vitek, our good friend Bill Vitek, who's been up here already, to say a word or two more about Strawn.
Good morning. Hi, thanks. Oh, don't do that. Strawn Donnelly was a philosopher, a philanthropist, a fly fisherman, an outdoorsman, an athlete. He was funny, he was tall and handsome. And I think Fred asked me to come up and talk about Strawn because he thought I shared at least one of those characteristics. And I think you can guess which one. I'd like to begin with two images of Strawn Donnelly, whose memory and legacy we celebrate this morning with this lecture. The first describes his agility and pure physical energy. A group of us were called to Matfield Green, Kansas in June 2004 by Wes to talk about ignorance. It was called Toward an Ignorance-Based Worldview, and Wes had a big sign up at the old school in Matfield Green that said, "Welcome, ignoramuses." And we had a T-shirt made. Can you stand up and show us that we were going to take it on tour, but we had a T-shirt made for it. So we all met in this 5th grade classroom and sat on these little chairs and talked about philosophy. So after a long day of talking in this 5th grade classroom of the old school, someone found a bat, a softball, and one glove. So we headed out to the field. We agreed that no one would use the only glove. Each of us gravitated to a position on the field that best reflected his or her athletic abilities or lack thereof. Though one of the oldest players on the field, Strawn went to third base, a position that only later I learned he had played at Hotchkiss in prep school, and that he was a two-sport athlete at Yale. I went to first base only because someone had beaten me to right field. So I apologize to you right fielders out there, but you know what I mean. But remember, we didn't have any gloves. So the second batter hit a line drive to Strawn's left. It was too hot to catch, and he wisely batted it to the ground. He eyed the runner's speed, calculated the time he had to make the throw, and then in a single motion scooped up the ball and fired a white rocket across the infield. I watched all this and stood with my hands outstretched, awaiting the impact, and I thought, are you kidding me? I caught the ball, we made the out, but a searing pain registered in my hands. This game went 7 innings, and Strawn became more energized as the game went on. He was fearless and in constant motion. It was Donnelly to Vitek, and we recorded many outs that day. He was no worse for the wear, but I had an aching welt in my right hand. That lasted a month. That's true. The second image reflects Strawn's philosophical side. He always insisted that the great cosmologists and metaphysical thinkers of the Western philosophical tradition be at the table with modern-day economists and scientists and policymakers.
and that our discussions about saving wetlands and building community in Chicago, for example, required these grand speculators and system builders to be at the center of the conversation. He called his references to Heraclitus and Parmenides and Spinoza and Whitehead philosophical riffs, a musical metaphor he understood well, and Fred just mentioned another musical metaphor about orchestral causation. He understood this musical metaphor well. Riffs are not just catchy notes. Riffs are musical memes, powerful ideas, true expressions of form. You know what I mean, the first notes of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, John Coltrane's explosion of notes at the beginning of Giant Steps, and so many others. Strawn never tired of reminding us that these philosophical riffs and roots were necessary to support the policy, scientific, and legal alternatives we sought. That, of course, was music to my philosophical ears, and because of Strawn, I completely changed my philosophical focus away from ethics and toward metaphysics. I dug in and started reading Spinoza and Whitehead, and I thought, are you kidding me? Right. Now it's my head that hurts, not my hand. Strawn was a deep-thinking philosopher in restless motion, and it seems like a contradiction to talk about a philosopher in motion. But Strawn's legacy is a beautiful and powerful example to all of us who want to engage this difficult and necessary work. Thought and action must go together. Strawn was a complex and beautiful patriot for all good things wild and free. He was too briefly our mentor and tutor. Those of us who know him miss him, but he continues to be in this place, and I can hear his voice still in the annual talks in his name.
Thank you for that. And so now I'll turn to introduce the Strawn Donnelly lecturer, Severin von Scharner Fleming. Severin and I go back almost 24 hours now, but we have things in common. We are both members of an elite group of graduates of the undergraduate short course in natural systems agriculture at the Land Institute. We also have in common that our last names, our German last names, are almost Gothic in appearance to anybody who tries to spell or pronounce them. And so we have a kinship, Severin and I. Severin's the executive director of the Greenhorns. I was using some of their publications in my previous job before I came here. Co-founder of that organization, of Farm Hack, of the Agrarian Trust, connections to the Schumacher Center for New Economics, and a farmer to boot. So Severin is going to give us our thoughts here on new customary rights, greenhorns, buckaroos, family farms, and the future tense. Severin.
Out front of the view that I now enjoy, living the dream on a saltwater farm in down East Maine, the pastures have turned purple with asters and dancing, fluttering moths. And the underbrush is all red and sumac-y. And I've been studying, from that position, I've been studying the intertidal every day because where I live has tides that are sometimes 26 feet up and down. And especially if it's sloped, then it's even more. And so flying over the air, looking down, I studied the topography of this Kansan landscape and all the riparian waterways that are all the bushes and trees. And I was like, oh my gosh, it's seaweed. Anyway, just you see what you're looking for, I guess. I am so thankful to be here and surrounded by such warmth and candor and Kansan hospitality, and to get to spend a bit of time more with this riddly sphinx who runs this joint. And yesterday, I laid in the shade, listening to Wes talk, and just feeling like a marble swirling around in the cosmos of history and future and possibility and emergence. And I found my mind made more nimble yet ever than it could. I don't know how are we gonna keep feeling that feeling. So thank you all, and thank you, Wes, and thank you for all this plant breeder energy of people looking at the genetics, nuzzling up into the genetics, and reacting to the plant kingdom and queendom so practically and openly, and how much attentiveness was in the field yesterday. I mean, farm tours are fun, but when it's blasting hot and windy, you sometimes expect the attention to stray a little, but it didn't. So that attunedness is really impressive to watch. So my talk today has a certain theme to it, but it might swirl a little. And the fundamental question is, what does the land want? Or specifically, what does the land want us to do? And so I come to you as someone with 10 years of data studying the young farmers movement, its aspirations, its characteristics, its kind of archetypes. The young people who are from city or from country backgrounds deciding to charge back to the land to make a livelihood and a place for themselves in the countryside. And looking out on this audience, it's interesting. At the barn dance, it felt like it was all these wonderful young dancers, and kind of like the cabin boys of the mariner scene. And now looking out here, there's some ancient mariners. There's some seasoned, able-bodied seamen who are still in the shop once a week with all their big collection of tools. And then there's some of us who... So what does the land want from all of us based on where we are in our own life story on the land? So some of the things that I have watched from these young farmers is what was talked about yesterday, the listening. Let me go a little back to where I am for a second, just to orient. Where I am now on the land, the buildings were built by men and kept by women who made a living hunting whales. And some of them become traders, and some of them became owners of boats. And they were, for instance, barrel staves to the Caribbean to carry molasses back to make rum. And some of them were going in clipper ships all the way around the world to carry back tea. Meanwhile, people back at home were busy in the woods cutting down the trees. And the next generation were out harvesting cod, then sardines, and successively working their way down the ecosystem to now where I look out from my farm and I see blue boats of guys harvesting seaweed to be turned into fracking powder for the extraction of oil from the earth. And so I'm aware, living in this kind of scar tissue ecology of coastal Maine, whose biggest beautiful trees were used to birth the economy in the age of sail, and who were proud revolutionists. In the first naval battles of the Revolutionary War took place down east. And realizing that we are in our architecture, in our identities, in the roles that we play, as she was saying, we really are the daughters of extraction, or the granddaughters, or the great-granddaughters of extraction. Whether we have an identity in this current generation as country people or city people. And and facing that, and acknowledging it, and feeling okay with it. It is. And so what I see when I see the opportunities that people are finding on the land, young people getting into agriculture, is kind of a similar opportunism to how those sea captains and sea captains' wives were navigating up these rivers, situating these tide mills, situating these smelters and these lumber mills, figuring out where was trade going to be with the Canadians when Thomas Jefferson shut down international trade so they could smuggle off behind the rocks in the fog. And that kind of strategery and opportunism is just as possible now. And that although we may be in the social media generation and finally tuned to the hum of each other's opinions in the click-o-net, and able to use the click-o-net to get the Amazon delivering anything we want in a rural area, we are, I think those who have made it in this game of new agrarianism have been the people who are able to, move that gesture from the Facebook into a handshake, into a partnership, move that onto a hip and lean back and think and consider and have some foresight and intuition. And, even since we're here and we're getting a little bit prophetic about the world that is changing so fast around us, and where do we want to situate ourselves in that world? So that has meant for many people borrowing, and stealing their way onto land. It's meant apprenticing themselves to elders they believe in and humbling themselves through the hard labor of weeding in the sun and hauling heavy things around, up, down, and over, and washing them and then putting them away and then taking them out again, and bearing the comments of people wearing very expensive shoes when they make note of the price that you're charging for your potatoes or your carrots. And the ways and the tactics that people are using to navigate then through this, pretty impenetrable thicket of a life trajectory, a professional trajectory in agriculture, is possible to start from any place, but relies on a few key factors. And so, especially to those of you in the room who haven't yet plunged your life into too many failures and are still rosy-cheeked and eager to do good and are here, I felt like it would be worthwhile underlining a few of those. Okay? So if you happen to be in the city, for instance, one thing I'll tell you is a lot of people who started in the city have friends who know about graphic design, have friends who worked in the restaurant business, have friends, let's just say it, they have friends because you're in proximity with your body to other people. And although heartbreak is something you will, feel in agriculture, and heartbreak of not having any land is something you will feel in the city, you can share that heartbreak with other people, and you will need those people once you're out on the land being heartbroken by dead livestock or by floods or storms or whatever it is. And so start now thinking strategically about the people that you trust and knowing the whole parts of your friends and colluding with them. And conspiring with them and co-visioning with them how the work that you're each doing contributes to each other. Because so many of the farms that we've watched start from a backyard to, from a hobby backyard to a small farm on a few acres on a handshake deal, to a 100-acre farm providing food for thousands of people, happened through not the success of one man or woman, but through the collusion of a community of people and the contributions of a community of people. And we see that again and again in the life stories of these successful young farmers. This would be the moment where I should tell you that we have been bundling and broadcasting and distributing, elbowing young farmers in the ribs, stories of their struggles and their aspirations in many different forms. So if you wanted to tune into some of that data, you can listen to 8 years of podcasts, and you can read the anthology of 50 essays and the 100 contributors in this year's almanac, and the one before that, and the one before that. And you can also access it by talking to any older person. If you ask them how they got started, they will tell you, and they'll like telling you. And so, if it's uncomfortable and shy to talk to strangers, that is a pretty good bet as an intro that it might go well for you. So starting in the city, starting where you are, figuring out what you can do, figuring out, of course, also your other careers, your other skills, your other aptitudes and economically viable winter activities, and getting trained up in those practices and having a friggin' resume together, such that you at one point or another could get a loan from either a bank or a micro-lending organization. On the talk yesterday, there was a question of, where is the money going to come from to support these young farmers? And that's a very important question. The practical thing I wanted to interject at that time, and I have a chance to interject now, is that we have FSA loans, microloans for beginning farmers, and we had them quicker because the guys from Silicon Valley who felt a small amount of guilt making their fortunes in PayPal set up a thing called Kiva, which does 0% interest loans up to $25,000 based on your credibility within your community and 2 paragraphs of text. We have a 100% repayment rate from the young farmers, so they love us, they being Kiva, because we also keep all of the donors who are donating to these revolving loans, just keep the money flowing into Kiva. So Kiva's like, man, this agricultural community is amazing. So if you know somebody who is at the beginning of a business plan, I just want to make sure you spread the word about these 0% interest loans, and also know that because we had such good data and because it was happening on the internet, the FSA had to change their tune and start issuing these loans to young people who presented with business plans that didn't include corn, beef, soy, and who were talking about growing for CSA and talking about growing for other markets. So okay, so here we are. We're talking about the life way of the new agrarians, their path onto the land. We're talking community. We're talking about cooking. Those young people who are making it out onto the land, often it starts in a little corner. Like, I'm thinking about my friends in Idaho who they started with sheep and they started with CSA in basically the little wet corners where none of the big equipment could fit, and who did a good enough job with that little corner and that forgotten barn that wasn't being used to deserve the attention of the next door neighbor, who also had a little back orchard, homestead orchard, and a little back acreage that was too small for the big machines, and who are now grazing their sheep in the margins of, kind of similar to how the trees are, in the bottomlands of this, monoculture of the Palouse, which is another wheat growing region in Washington and Idaho. And so that the ecological and the grazing of these areas through intensely managed stewardship is actually happening kind of on the fault lines of the dominant land use pattern. And if you're thinking in those terms and you're squinting and you're saying, well, you know, I want to heal the land, the project is land repair, I want to re-diversify, I want to grow for a local and regional market, I want diversity, I want hedges, I want sentience, I want cud on this landscape, it's that kind of strategery to wiggle your way in that you're going to need. And one thing that is noticeable is once they wiggle enough, all of a sudden, people show up and say, you know, there's an abandoned cranberry bog down there. And people are bringing that chutzpah or, you know, insanity. And you trust them enough to tell them what they need to know to do more and better. That's the kind of economic solidarity that doesn't happen with dollars at all. So I just wanted to include that right up front with the 0% interest loans and the cash, because I know for a fact that the number of tool sheds that are in this barn right now could resettle thousands of acres of land. And the collections of, you know, the hoarders of metal and kind of mechanically inclined of you have a lot to teach those of us who didn't have the mechanic shop and who are struggling to figure out potato digging on slightly of a short notice. So the coming together, and I think we've spent a lot of time organizing parties for young farmers to meet each other and convene and feel their own momentum and show their strong bodies to one another, because actually the young women are starting to outnumber the young men, and so it's getting competitive. And what we've noticed in that is that the weaving project of each of these farms can hold more than just that farm together. And so that once there was one farm, for instance, I'm thinking now of Essex Farm, really wonderful horse-powered farm in upstate New York, attract ambitious people as interns. They work so hard, they become high on their own chemistry. They fall in love. They go spit it out right down the road, and they start their own farm. I mean, it's a slightly more complicated story than that, but there's a successional dynamic that is ignited when this new kindling touches these old embers of the land and the place and what it has been and wants to be. And those flames start licking out in every direction. And those flames then can hold, as I say, more than just that farm. So once there's one CSA membership and there's one person's college friends and high school roommates and, you know, professional lineage from the West Coast and the guy they knew who went to Alaska to fish, all of a sudden they're selling frozen fish and they're selling someone else's cheese and they're selling someone else's eggs. And yes, Whole Foods was stolen by Amazon. Let me promise you this, in the next 10 years you will see a lot of women and men of my age starting new grocery stores because we know that we need it and we're willing to do the logistics. And so many of the most successful farm regions that we watch, you know, in this project of new agrarianism are already running their own food hubs. You know, some of the most successful farms are already distributing 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 other producers' products on a weekly basis. They've got the technology, they've got the sheds, you know, they've got the wherewithal. So, anyway, I don't want to go too far on that, but if you're that type who thinks, oh, I want to be involved in agriculture so badly, but I don't know because I have a bad back, you know, there's room for you, and we will really appreciate you in that project. So we talked about the tactical geography, we talked about economic solidarity, we talked about, you know, lending someone an electric heater or part of helping them out of a ditch. We talked about place awareness and the history, knowing the history of the place that you lived, you know, what is likely to be the secret cache of gutter material or roofing that you can find in abandoned old barns, and what are likely to be the pieces of equipment hanging around. What does the land want? So the 19th century homestead where I am now living my dream didn't give the land exactly what it wanted. And although there was a lot of good common sense that was applied in that paradigm, we have improvements to make on how these arrangements are made. And a lot of the identity that is inherent with this white homesteader, hipster meets lumber hat meets logger, what are these things called? Slapping, yes. It's not enough. That's not enough of an identity for the project that we have, and it's not enough people, and it's too exclusive, and it's unfair, and it's inaccessible, and it won't work. So although it's funny sometimes to dress up like that and to be in a nostalgic kind of a way, it's obvious to all of us, I would say from the world I live in, that we've got to have more people on our team than just ourselves and our wife, or our, like, American Gothic doesn't account for the fact that, you know, the woofers also need their dishes done. And that really also runs up against one of the problems that we have in terms of the affordability of farmland, which is that it is not affordable to buy farmland on a farming income, or even with a supplemental income in this country at this time. And so more and more of these new farmers are having to figure out different arrangements that are dynamic, that are experimental, that are, in some cases, disequilibrious, to beg, borrow, and steal their way onto this farmland. And if you go onto our Agrarian Trust website, you can read a whole catalog of case studies that we've been doing to look at how these people are doing this work. But what is clear, and we have convened now multiple meetings and national symposia to discuss at length the land question in the United States, is that way more out-of-the-box thinking and way more collaborative and cooperative and conspiratorial economic relations will need to flourish and expand if we're going to get the people back where they belong, doing what the land wants. And that we will require a heck of a lot more participation from city eaters and suburban eaters, institutions, supply chain players, and farm families who own land, making decisions that are what the land wants than we currently have. We're going to need a lot more weird wiggling and thoughtful squinting and kind of around the corner prophesizing to eventuate in those young people having access, durable access to land. And you'll notice I'm not saying ownership. And that's because ownership implies a right to cut down all those trees like they did in the 19th century. And ownership implies a commodification of an ecology to sustain a nation that's building itself through export, or that's shipping everything off to be made into fracking liquid or to be made into coal, or whatever it is, whatever it was that's being shipped. And I think in the understanding that's emerging of places that have seen their regional food system develop, there's an understanding that we all have some right to that land, not just the owner. It's all of our land. It's all of our upland. It's all of our watershed. It's all of our wildlife. It is our common heritage and common protection against hurricanes. It is our common plight, that landscape. And our common resolve is needed in order to hold it for our own benefit. And so all these conversations, it's all very nice and abstract, groovy talk. But practically, I think what it's meaning is certain rights will go away from the way that we farm land in the future. For instance, the right to degrade and destroy and export. So that if a community comes together to hold the land, this doesn't have to be all the land, it doesn't have to be tomorrow, but in the different ways that we experiment, that when those communities come together to hold the land for their own food sovereignty, for their own self-determination, for their own region and food security, then the kind of farming that will happen there will be the kind of farming that we're talking about here. It will be restorative farming. It will be diverse farming. It will be multi-enterprise farming. It will be farms that also are baking the bread, farms that also are running the summer camps, farms that are doing mother calf and doing milk and doing hay and doing greenhouses full of winter greens. And each of those different enterprises are being run by different people, not just man and wife all alone. Because that's the intensity of management that the land wants. And that's the intensity of care and discernment that these kinds of farm businesses require. So that's going to mean getting along differently and relating comfortably in a way that's quite intimate. And I think we all have a lot of those skills already from the barn dance scene. And touching each other's hands and waists comfortably and with consent and in respect. But I feel it's important to recognize that as we renegotiate what our service of the land will be in this highly changing climate and developing a whole new language and culture of the weather and its fluctuations, that we're also renegotiating how we are operating with one another across privilege, across class, across gender battle lines, and that discomfort is also exciting because it shows us that we're wiggling out from something that's already making us uncomfortable. And yeah, hips, I think, are a big part of this. The hips. Keeping a little bit of a wide stance. Okay, so I grew up as a city kid, and both my parents are urban planners, and I got to go out and fall in love with the countryside because my great-grandfather polluted a river and made money in textiles. And so I got to experience a farm life and a farm summer and a farm love that was basically paid for by poisoning a river. And my mother, for the last 15 years, has been running a river conservancy in my hometown. And she always says, and she doesn't actually talk about that very explicitly, but she says, you know, if you want to change something, you're going to need to smile, and you need to grit your teeth, and you're going to take 30 years, and you'll do it. And frankly, her methodology is very effective. So I guess I would just say that I'd love to talk more in detail about, you know, how this agrarian trust is structured and a lot of the different ways in which different communities are negotiating, you know, church lands and institutional lands and, you know, beer companies adopting farmers to, you know, take all their brewery waste and turn it into compost and start farms, and, you know, school districts and land trusts who are planting orchards that are community orchards for, you know, genetic base of experimental or historic orchard crops, et cetera, like all this interesting experimentation that's going on. But I think that's the point, is a lot of it is going to be experimentation, and there's the volition that is felt in the hearts of the young people who are wanting to farm matches the volition of those of us. It's a distributed kind of a volition. And it's a volition that has to be like dancing up against each other's and dancing with and observing from and learning from and being transparent about, well, that didn't work. And we figured out why, but we're not mad at them. We're just observing that that was part of their volition, because that's how life is. Life is dancing around, my kittens with the weird paws. I mean, that trait is so common in Maine. I don't know why. Each of us is holding our genetic truth in our bodies, and our genetic truth informed by our history and the place histories we've been a part of. And I think that this exciting time of rediscovering new frameworks, new kinds of relation, new associations, new associative forms, whether it be in hurricane response or in pipeline defense or in spontaneous solidarity of the female gender expressed through millions of marchers in the streets, that we're blobbing well in this crisis. And we just got to keep on blobbing with our hips. I think I'm going to leave it there. I know there's no questions. I'm going to call on young people first, and then we'll flip back and forth. Green. She asked the question, which is, how do we get the word out further to recruit more young people who aren't already tuned into the new agrarian revolution and make it really accessible? Well, this is like when, as an executive director of a small nonprofit, I get the chance to talk about my programs, right? So we actually have been lucky enough to partner with a nice organization called Guayaki, which is actually a company that makes tea, who has funded us to do a new series of programs, expanding from the anthologies and the almanacs and the radio and the documentary and our 3,000 film screenings and our partnership with co-ops across the country, trying to get mass media attention for the young farmer movement, which we have successfully done for a long time, and from page of USA Today and New York Times and NPR and BBC and all over the big mainstream media, and then often people's grandmothers cut it out and mail it to their kid who seems to be oriented in that direction. But now we've started doing these like short films for more of like a Vice audience to explain and interpret specific strategic life ways that help to intervene in our dysfunctional food system. So we start with a dysfunctional feature, i.e. monoculture, or i.e. drought, or i.e. concentration of power, or i.e. I can't get access to land. And we start with the dilemma statement, and then we track the life story and attitudinal observation or attitudinal approach of people who are kind of cracking at that problem. And so they're called ourland.tv, and you can watch them on the internet for free. But I think it would be really great for other partners to come along who are in the food supply, in the what did she say yesterday? In the supply chain, other supply chain partners, acting as protagonists and transmitters of this information about how to apply your life directly, other than as a consumer of these products. And so I'd like to just say really openly, like, if you have ideas, let's talk. Because although many of the best organic farms have waiting lists of 300 applicants for their jobs, for their apprenticeship jobs, and although the organic conferences are now having 20, 30, 40% increases in the youth attendance at their conferences and are offering scholarships, we still are missing a lot of black and brown faces. We still have many more recruits to do in especially farm communities of kids who otherwise are just going to go to FFA and see the big equipment and see that it's not really resonating. The narratives there are not really resonating with what they see on their home farm. And we just have been attending a couple of FFA conferences in the past couple of years. And actually, the last one was called, it was called Hunger Games. And because that's like a Hollywood movie, but it's a Hollywood movie about a trilogy of speculative fiction novels written by a woman about a totalitarian food state where the different ethnic groups fight each other and the central control of ridiculous people fight those different producer groups off of each other to maintain control. But then the revolutionaries join forces between the different producer groups and overcome the empire. We all know about the Hunger Games, right? Okay, so here you have, Monsanto and Tyson and DuPont and Cargill and all these big guys with their big tractors saying the motto of the FFA. This is 60,000 kids. Thank you, Organic Valley, for letting us go. Saying volunteer to be a tribute, i.e., offer yourself as a victim in the Hunger Games. And so I think there's a level of discord between this propagandistic fake news of big ag to these kids is freaking those kids out, and they're opting out. Our former Secretary of Agriculture, Vilsack, would note frequently that only 16% of the U.S. population is rural, but 41% of the armed services are rural, and that the recruitment of farm boys into the military is a lot to do with the fact that farming, the conventional system. I don't need to repeat this, but like the recruitment rates are low, and we're losing these kids, and those kids have land, and so let's work with these kids, all the different kids. The kids of different backgrounds are, let's marry them and cross them up. Let's hybridize. But if you have other answers that you would rather hear, I'd love to hear them, and we should talk about it after. And that goes for everyone.
You mentioned land trusts, and at least the local land trusts are very much about local control. So I'm willing to bet that many of us here today have local land trusts in our community. So my question is, what have you been doing with land trusts and the Land Trust Alliance, the national organization that might be an avenue for you?
Yeah, well, and the land trusts are getting to get a little bit wider hips too. There's been some strong structural critique of land trusts preserving beautiful vistas surrounding beautiful homes of people who grow hay for horses that they occasionally ride. And that critique is widely shared by many of the young farmers, some of whom then grace the front catalogs, but the minority of the acreage of those same land trusts. So, puppy. And so our land trust is actually the Agrarian Land Trust, of which I am a co-founder, and happily hiring 2 full-time positions for 3 full years of employment in our beautiful startup. A little bit of an embodied critique, those limits, but also recognizing that, they did a lot of good pretty fast. And they represent a consciousness of community interest and community ownership and the community project of conservation and restoration. And so there's really cool things I could point you to, which is something called OPAV, or what are like the super easements or affordability easements that are being put on now, which essentially says, if we use tax dollars or local fundraising dollars to preserve this farmland, remove the development rights off it, then the people who are farming it have to be growing food. Sounds obvious, but it's not. And then, furthermore, that farmland will remain affordable into the next and the next and the next owner, such that it doesn't become just gentrified into a non-food producing landscape. So yes, it's good that it's not built upon, but actually good habitat for new growers. Because if it is so proportionately closer to white wealthy people, that's like, that's like a petting zoo place. Those stuff, like those are exactly the places that need incubating new farmers. Those are like the gentle places to have their spawns. And then we send out to the wilds and the woolies and the cheaper land and the hard desert and the land is cheaper. But let's incubate them gently in those kinds of places. Well, it's funny because I've just been haggling with the internet provider in my town because we want to put like free high-speed internet in the old Oddfellows Hall. And, a lot of towns have this amazing infrastructure, built from the beautiful lumber that forged the identity of this age of extraction. And they're empty and they're falling apart and, like the key is held by an 85-year-old. And, and it's $125 a month to get high-speed internet in there. And so basically my scheme for that I can tell you about, and there's different schemes different people do, and I have a whole little resource of things from the farm hack world of distributed network solutions that are like in Catalonia and in rural Italy. But my solution is that we're going to have a blueberry winnower, a chicken plucker, an apple cider press, butcher tables for processing chickens, wood splitter, and why we got it in the first place. But basically try to make that a shared expense because it is, like, especially in your down. I'm going to need a little more money to spend time to dance that dance right now. We don't have capacity. Like, we were able to go a couple times, and we gave away a lot of flyers and website stuff, and we were able to distribute what we already make. But I think that to do that, marketing your product, especially when your product is a little bit beginning. But I don't know, like that thing about the blueberry, not the blueberry, well actually it was blueberries, the cranberry bogs. Even just this over and over and over story about, people who came, maybe they had nose rings, maybe they didn't have nose rings, but they were not from there. And they found a homestead and they were busting their butts and, cutting hedges and planting trees and laying drip lines and putting in pumps and, moving rapidly around on the land. And then, just like magic timing, somebody rolls up and delivers them the piece of equipment or tells them that important piece of information. And it's not even charm, it's like the charisma of virtue. And, good show, putting on a good show. And that also aggregates a certain kind of power that that you see, like that basically a part of almost all these farm stories was this magical moment where it was basically on the line and, stuff fell into place. And, I'm sure that happened to Yvonne Chenard at some point too. But that definitely is an ingredient I see across the board in these stories. It's like, when everything was on the line, it had to work. Oh, I'm being cut off.
It pains me to do it. Severin von Scharner Fleming. Thank you. We're blobbing along in here. There are a couple things that I want to take care of here. One was a thing I neglected to say about Strawn Donnelly. Does anybody know what state Strawn Donnelly was from? Anybody know? Illinois? That's right, Illinois. So that's one thing. The other thing I want to say is that, as is apparent to people who are even here for the first time, this event is a big, complicated enterprise. Our work is a big, complicated enterprise here. The team that we have here at the Land Institute is the best team that I have ever worked with, hands down. And we have a hand for the staff here. As you're dismissing in a little bit, as you see people in green polo shirts, I'm not going to say give them a hug, but use your judgment. Give them a handshake at least, because it's an amazing team. So let me say to draw us to a close here. Let me relate to you an experience I had here. It'll be a couple experiences. The first one is about a job that I had a very good fortune to have in my early 20s. It was with an organization that has the name of a state in the name. The name of the state starts with I. Does anybody know what it is? Iowa. Iowa is the right one. I worked at Practical Farmers of Iowa, familiar for just a couple of years, but it was a formational experience. So this is the farmer-led sustainable ag organization that, among other things, brought rigorous on-farm research to Midwestern U.S. Farming systems. PFI is the strongest and most vibrant that it's ever been, but I'm glad nonetheless that my time there was there when the founder, Boone, Iowa farmer Dick Thompson, was still alive and still going strong. Now Dick stayed close to home most of the time. The books that he published had a spiral binding, and he mostly focused on being a good farmer. But I'll say that nevertheless, despite this modest rhythm of life, or maybe because of this modest rhythm of life, he needs to be elevated in kind of the pantheon of agrarians. Is his advice on interacting. Another Thompson line that I'm fond of is, you can't buy these in a bag. What I'm going to pull out here is something that I lifted from Farm Research Manual, the self-published 2000 edition. Quote, be a good observer, keep track of everything, record in 3 1/4 by 4 1/2 inch notebook. Keep book in zipper pocket of Liberty bibs. End quote. Dick's notebook, he spent a lot of time waving his notebook. Was sort of a totem for him that was constantly ready to hand in that zipper pocket. And Dick insisted that his whole farming system hinged on the discipline of observation and learning. That notebook was the concentration point of it. So of course, it's a powerful lesson for farming, and it may be a powerful lesson for some other things also. Now, to Dick Thompson's front pocket notebook, I want to add another voice and another pocket, in fact. Some of you may be aware of Dr. Liz Carlisle, perhaps from her book Lentil Underground, published a couple of years ago. She documents the journey of a group of audacity-rich but capital-poor farmers in Montana, where she's from. These folks have carved out an economic pathway for farming in a small and diversified manner in an age of big and monoculture. But today I'm thinking about a previous work of Liz's, a paper she wrote in 2013 called Critical Agrarianism. And the journey that's documented there is a different one. It's the journey that the agrarian tradition that we've been referring to has taken from origins in people like Locke, people like Jefferson, people like Creve Coeur, a journey that writing has taken all the way to people with names like Leopold and Berry and Jackson. And certainly, I think, Liz thinks, this has been a vital tradition that's underpinned most of our best moments in agriculture in the time since then. But Liz notes, and once again I agree, that even though our 20th and 21st century writers have done a good job in the following respect, it's notable that their 18th and 19th century starting points, the writers who started this journey, their starting point could aptly be described as old white men and property. And so despite the fact that we've done some skillful navigation to evolve the agrarian tradition with those pitfalls in mind, we still have opportunities to fall into them, and we still need to be mindful. And so Liz, in that vein, proposes a list of 5 of what she calls back pocket tools, or points to keep on hand to make sure that we're not practicing a nostalgic agrarianism, but a critical agrarianism, to use her terminology. Point 1, or tool 1, we need to not fall in the trap of reflexively blaming rural problems on the urban or urban problems on the rural. Instead, we need to view our shared social and economic and environmental problems as a shared struggle that unites us rather than something that divides us in a blame manner. Point 2, we don't want to confuse what are legitimate agrarian values, like producing a good crop or practicing healthy forms of competition in the marketplace or with neighbors. We don't want to confuse those healthy values with vices like productivism or growth capitalism, which are ultimately corrosive to people, land, and community. And these things can blur in the middle a little bit, and so we need to be alert. Point 3, despite, again, healthy agrarian values of self-determination, of self-discipline, instead, and I'll quote Liz directly here, a just agrarian prosperity can never be achieved through individual efforts or self-sufficiency alone, end quote. So we'll all ultimately succeed or fail based on our ability to work together and to relate to one another as kinfolk. Point 4, Liz calls for us to build up a consciousness about the intersection of race and ethnicity with the issues that we're talking about and organizing around in agriculture and in farming. For example, over the period 1901 to 2000, African American farm ownership in the U.S. declined 94%. Did we notice that? And in the attention that we've paid to farm loss of farms, did we really notice that statistic? And then finally, point 5, back pocket tool number 5, that in the same manner that we need to be alert to reconcile gender equity and the role of gender roles with the agrarian scenes that we see in our mind's eye. The first agrarian writers, people like Locke and Jefferson, were after liberation from tyranny as they saw it. If we want to complete the journey to liberation from tyranny, we need to move, I would submit, our boundaries of social consideration a considerable ways beyond where those boundaries were set several centuries ago. And so then, to put an example to it, and I'll depart from Liz Carlisle after this here, that she closes this part of her writing with the example of Will Allen, the founder of Growing Power, urban farmer in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, somebody who has rural roots in the South and has used his childhood experiences, positive and negative, to propel him into sort of casting a new urban agrarianism, that we need to note his elevation to this list of agrarian voices out there to kind of give us an example there. At this point, we're here at Prairie Festival at the Land Institute. I'm going to stop for a calibration check. We had scientist updates earlier. We talked about Kernza commercialization. There's probably at least one person in this building, and if they weren't thinking this at this Prairie Festival, perhaps they thought it in a previous Prairie Festival, at least one person that's probably asked, what does any of this have to do with perennial grain crops? Now, of course, perennial grain crops are the work that the Land Institute is best known for. It's certainly the case that if we want to survive as a species over the long run, or at least survive as an organized society, that we have to radically transform the biological end of agriculture. And so we might ask, this business about race, this business about gender, seeing eye to eye, isn't it a higher priority to save the planet? And I have several answers to that I'll propose. The first one is that things like equality, things like liberation, things like kinship as a species are absolute moral values in themselves. We note that saving our soil, saving our atmosphere, it's true, are some of the gravest existential crises that we've ever faced. But that does not dismiss us from caring for our sisters and brothers. And we need to balance these things. My second answer is a sort of a utility answer here that if we're interested in perennial grain crops, to confront these existential crises, we need to be clear on what the role of grain crops are in a future food system. Issues related to how we use energy, issues related to emissions. We've known what we need to do, but we haven't been able to muster ourselves as a society to do them. And so I would submit that the wisdom and the love that it takes to make decisions like that we could call them quantitative traits of the soul, in a little bit of the same manner that things like yield and things like productive stand life are quantitative traits of crops that we improve slowly year after year by many cycles of breeding. We need to build up these judgment traits in ourselves so that we have the judgment when the time comes to make use of the new tools that we are creating through the research process here. Another way that this has been said in the past is that we need a new heart and a new spirit. We need our heart of stone to be replaced by a heart of flesh. And it wasn't in Ezekiel, but I'm going to tack on that sometimes it seems to me like we need a new brain also. We can work on that. But I'll say that if we can't access the clarity of the different visions that we have, if we can't access the neighborliness that our neighbors have the potential to hold for us, and if we can't set to work. Now, I do have to admit that in senses, I'm an agronomist at heart. That was a lot of my academic training. In one sense, I am here because I'm really, really jazzed about perennial grain crops. And I certainly will say that there is no work in the world that is more important than the work that our scientists here are doing, or our collaborators on 5 continents at this point. But we do need to recognize that there's work that is as important, and that's the work we've been speaking of getting right with each other. And so it's been put that it all turns, put by a hillside farmer from Kentucky, it all turns on affection, is what it comes down to. Now, I have one more story in me here. And that's about the time that I went, 5, 6, 7 years ago, drove to Nauvoo, Illinois, to buy a book at a bookstore that my friend Estelle Neff runs there. I say he's my friend. I think he's something like my fourth cousin, twice removed. We'll say friend here. And so we got to talking, and he may have been trying to distract me from negotiating on the sticker price of this used book. A little elevated, I think. But he got into to telling me a story about going quite a thing in 1948. And a lot of the story had to do with the journey of 1948 to Chicago, and there were some hair-raising pieces about Lakeshore Drive, which was only 2 years old itself in 1948, and even about having to turn around and back up and wind through, and PTSD kind of trailering experience. But then where the discussion went from there is what I'll mostly tell you. So they got there and they unloaded the cattle, these dairy cattle, and they found their way to where the stalls and the stanchions and where there was hay and so forth. And of course, that just because you take dairy cattle on a 300-mile jaunt, you're not excused from milking them exactly when they expect to be milked. And so, of course, it worked out that as they were there, one of the milkings every day was after the close. There were 3 or 4 cops that were watching. And by the third night, there were like 10 cops sitting around watching. There can't have been any security at that point anywhere else at the facility. And of course, the reason for this fascination, the reason that it had passed by word of mouth among the police officers that were there to come look at this, is that they'd never seen dairy cattle milked before. Now, I want to be really clear at this point in the story about what kind of story this is not. This is not a story about city folks being out of touch with food. We have a lot of, we do a lot of that, and some of it's warranted, but this is not a story like that. For one thing, if he'd been there 10 years earlier, certainly 20 years earlier, there wouldn't have been as much fascination. As that was somewhere in there was about when the idea that we could separate our affairs in these ways took over. What I'm saying is 10 or 20 years earlier, people would have remembered seeing cows milked. But the more important reason that it's not one of those stories is that when Estill was telling this part of the story, when he was describing the looks on those men's faces watching, Estill's face and his voice had reverence in it. Reverence for the moment that he realized he was in. He was like 18 probably at the time. Even at 18, he realized that he was in a moment there where the scripted roles had fallen away, the bravado had fallen away, there wasn't any city, there wasn't any rural, that there were just people and animals and an act of sharing that was going on. That was a crossroads experience. Notebook in our front pockets and the discipline that goes along with it to be a good observer, keep track of everything that happens, and we can keep the tenants in our back and just. So let's get to work. Thank you for being here. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Shake the hand of a staff member. Prairie Festival will return in 2018, September 28th through 30th. Take care.